Okay, welcome everyone to today's symposium and award ceremony for Mikael Skagenholt. My name is Kenny Skagerlund, and I'm an associate professor in psychology at Linköping University. And together with Mikael Skagenholt, the man of the hour, and Jonas Olofsson, who is the chair of the Swedish Committee for Psychology, we are hosting this event, and my role is very limited, but it is to moderate the events today and keep the talks on track. And if you have any questions about logistics, you can ask me. So we will have four speakers today, and we will also have a break for coffee at 3:15, to 3:15, right outside this room. And then we will reconvene for our two subsequent talks. So without further ado, I leave the room for Jonas Olofsson.
Thank you, Kenny, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Jonas Olofsson. I'm the chair of the Swedish National Committee for Psychological Sciences. And I want to share a few words with you before we start with the academic program about why we're here today and why we in the committee feel like this is such an important event. So the National Committee is one of 18 scientific committees appointed by the Royal Academy, the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. We currently have 15 members representing different Swedish universities. And our mission is to promote psychology as a science and as a clinical profession. And we do this in different ways, and we interact especially with the Class 9 of the Royal Academy for Social Sciences. So a common theme in our many engagements is to raise the quality of psychological science and education, and also to showcase the impact of psychology in society and the relevance of psychological research for society. And one of the highlights every year for us is this award ceremony. So the award to young researchers in psychology, this is a way for us to celebrate our most promising young researchers. The prize consists of a personal award of 50,000 Swedish crowns and support for organizing a symposium here at the Royal Academy. And this symposium was put together by Mikael together with the supervisors Kenny and Professor Ulf Treff. And this event, I believe, embodies the purpose of the committee is to promote excellent research in psychology and to showcase the importance of psychological science for society. So the academic program, I think, will underscore that today. So with that, I would like to thank all of you, the organizers, the speakers, you as the audience, and also the excellent technical staff here at the Royal Academy for being here today. And with that, I welcome Mikael, who will introduce the speakers.
Okay, thank you, Jonas, for the introduction, as well as Kenny for the pre-introduction, and to all of you for being here today, of course. So I just want to briefly mention sort of my rationale for putting together this symposium and how I feel that this is a great representation of the field that I'm a part of. So we have talks today by Professor Håkan Fischer, who is a professor in human biological psychology. As you probably gathered from the title of this event, we are going to be focusing on numbers, mathematics, and the brain. And I think Håkan will provide an excellent overview of the brain part as a sort of gentle introduction into why should we care about the brain and about neuroscience, and what does that contribute to psychological science as a whole. Following that, we will have a presentation on Zoom by Dr. Ian Lyons, who is an associate professor of psychology at Georgetown University in the United States. And he is also the head of the Math Brain Lab. And they do a lot of, they perform a combination of research focused both on the sort of neuroscientific aspect, but also in relation to things like educational neuroscience and intervention studies and applied sort of teaching scenarios where this type of knowledge or this type of research can actually be applied. Following this, we have a presentation by habilitus Dr. Karin Kusian, who is affiliated with the Center for MR Research at the University of Zurich with a specific focus on children's numerical cognition. And she will introduce primarily then dyscalculia as a concept, so struggles with math or math deficit, and how brain science or how neuroimaging can be of help to sort of further develop theories around what essentially could constitute a problem in mathematics, and how we deal with deficits in math. So the idea here is that I tried to put together a symposium that would somehow correspond to what I personally would find the most interesting to attend. So it's a bit egotistical in one sense, but I also think that we have a really nice sort of lineup of speakers here to fully capture why this type of research is important and why it is interesting. And we try to also follow a sort of hourglass sort of model here in the disposition of these talks. So we will first begin by having a very broad overview of neuroscience and how neuroscientific methods contribute to psychology, followed by more specific talks on numerical cognition and mathematics, going into a bit more detail. And I will then myself later cap this off with a more sort of general overview again. So we sort of follow a broad focus into a more specific focus and then try to sort of tie this all together in a broader sense again. And thank you to Karin for the idea behind this sort of hourglass approach here. Yes, so what I think this symposium will capture is sort of the intersection of all of these three different aspects. So numbers and mathematics in a very broad general sense. What is a number? How do we apply numbers in daily use and in mathematical contexts? Typical and atypical cognition. So what happens to individuals who suffer from math deficits in various ways versus individuals who are then sort of more typically developing, and also how this then intersects with neuroimaging approaches and the added value of neuroimaging over and above sort of behavioral approach to psychology. So that concludes this sort of very brief introductory talk, and I leave the stage open to Håkan for his presentation. Thank you.
So, let's see. Hi everyone, nice to see you here. My name is Håkan Fischer, and as Mikael said, I'm a professor here, here at Stockholm University, next door here, over on the other side of the street. And I've been here since 2011, and before that I was at KI, and before that at Harvard, and then I was at Uppsala University. So I've been traveling around, and I've been into this field for many years now. I started out in 1994 with my PhD in Uppsala, and from there, I've been doing then brain imaging research now for many, many years. I don't dare to count all the years yet. So I've also seen the development of a field that I hope will that I'll sort of get you your general view upon by talking about the strengths and the weaknesses and the threats and the opportunities that we have in the field, because there are many of them. But I would like to just take off by saying that when I started my PhD in '94, I had a supervisor Mats Fredriksson in Uppsala, he told me, Håkan, you are now going into cognitive neuroscience. This is a very, very sort of unpredictable future for this field. You know, we don't know if it will fly or sink. So it's up to you to dare or not dare if you would like to go into this field. And I was like, I love this field, you know. So yeah, so please go. But we don't know what will happen in the future. It could very well sink, and that would of course be bad for you and your future in academia. But I was like, okay, I take that risk. In the first year or so, I could read all the articles from this field overall, right? 10 a week maybe or so. Now there are like hundreds a day, I would say. And there are all these labs all around the world. And at that time, there were very, very few labs. So it has really taken off and been now like a major part of the current psychological landscape, I would say. You know, so I'm now sitting also in the Swedish Research Council, and last year we handed out 10 grants in psychology. I would say like 8 of them were into this field, right? So that gives you some kind of feeling for that this is really, at least as for now, it's very much in the center of attention. It might change, right, of course, but right now it's like this. So what then is cognitive neuroscience? You can see a picture here to the right showing that we are interested in the brain, but we're also interested in behavior. We're interested in what is happening when you combine these two levels of analysis. What's happening in the brain when we are feeling a feeling, what's happening in the brain when we are thinking, making decisions, or whatever, right? And we have this approach because we think that we will know more about psychological mechanisms if we don't only look at behavior. So we look at behavior, yes, but also on brain function. So we have like 2 levels of analysis at least. And in the brain, as you see here, on top of the brain, we can look at brain structure. How is the brain, you know, what does it look like? You know, gray matter, white matter. Also the function, what is happening, where is things happening, you know? Consciousness here, maybe love is here, or whatever, right? So, and then we have also the molecular level. We can also measure neurotransmitters in the brain, and we can combine all these levels of analysis, which we feel then will make it much more deeper knowledge about the concept that we are looking at, as for example memory, than only looking at behavior, right? So we are trying to combine then different methods, right? So psychology is one method, of course, our main method from this perspective, but also neurobiology and also different types of techniques, right? We have different techniques to measure brain function and brain structure, and we are combining them. So it's a very multifaceted area of research, which is also very sort of demanding for researchers in the field because we need to be experts in all of these things, right? And Mikael is one of them, and he's excellent on this, right? So we are aiming then at looking at mechanisms behind cognition and mental disorders in general, but also then from a behavior as well as from a brain perspective, so from 2 perspectives. So then, how has then cognitive neuroscience transformed psychology? So psychology, for the general audience, psychology is very much like Freud, and you know there are all these people out there, typically from the like from 100 years ago or so, and at that time psychology took off. It took off like in the early 17th century, like 1820 or so, you know, by William James, whom you can see here to the right. And what was special at that time was that psychology was very much into introspection, right? You're feeling yourself things, right? Oh, I feel like this, or I think like this, you know, that's like a method. Freud, of course, you know, he had all these things, you know, he dreamt things, and then he wrote articles about this. So that's where psychology comes from. But then it has sort of traveled throughout now 150 years or so, or maybe 200 years, it depends on how we count. And now we are very much into the biological part of this spectra, right? So we have moved away from introspection into very much quantitative way of looking at psychology, from qualitative to quantitative measures overall. So, and I think that we have maybe moved a bit too far into the quantitative side. I think that we also should have qualitative measures like open questions and talk with people about what is happening, because I'm trained in not talking with people. You give them questionnaires, right? How do you feel? Questionnaire, right? But please, answer me instead, right? So we are now trying to get verbal responses, and then we use AI or something to sort of find patterns in this, right? But anyway, psychology has gone from introspection to cognitive neuroscience, from the qualitative to the quantitative side, but now I think that we are sort of mixing everything up to sort of get to the next level. That's how I think about this. And we have, in doing this type of research, we have found out that different areas in the brain seem to be very important for different types of psychological domains, right? As for example, amygdala is very important for emotional processing. The hippocampus here in the temporal lobes are very important for cognitive function, and so on and so forth. So that's really vital findings that has been done in this field of research. And this has also led now to clinical applications. You can diagnose people, by looking at brain scans or in different ways, and also you can perform treatments based on this type of findings from this field. So it has really moved not only into basic science, which is sort of where I'm standing and where Mikael is mostly standing, but also into the clinic, right? So now it has changed also that field, like in psychiatry or wherever. So, but this idea that brain and behavior sort of goes together, that something in the brain is happening and then it's important for behavior, it has a long tradition, right? So in the early theories in psychology, it was very, very much thought so that various types of mental processes are located at different spots in the brain, right? So moral might be located here, economics is located here, and so on and so forth. And now 150 years ago or so, it was a sort of pseudoscience called phrenology that sort of took this standpoint, and you can see that on the picture up to the right here, that they saw that like moral people have activations here, and the economic people have it here, and so on and so forth. But that idea sort of also went into the early cognitive neuroscience community. So when I started out, we looked always for amygdala, because I'm an emotional researcher, right? So we always like, did you find amygdala? Did you find amygdala? No. Well, then it's no emotion, right? So it was a lot about different types of regions, and that they were so important for things. Hippocampus, amygdala, frontal lobes, visual cortex, and all of these things. But now the field has moved away a bit from that, and now we're looking much more into networks, right? So we are looking at brain networks, where, as for example, the amygdala is maybe the hub in the network, but it's the network as such that is important for us to understand. So we are now measuring the entire brain and looking at different networks and how they change over time. So that's a new thing. So it's the networks that we are looking for, and the connections, is it a stronger connection here, or is it a weaker connection here? So all these things are what we are looking at now. And that is also because we can, right? Because now we have the computer power to look at the brain in that way. Because when I started out, we couldn't even get a number out of these pictures that we saw. We saw a picture with a red dot and a blue dot, and that was a nice picture. But we couldn't get out any numbers from these pictures. And we said, when we get statistics, when we get numbers, we can do statistics. That will really change everything, right? And now it's like, it's so super complex. And that's also why we have moved away from looking at regions to looking at networks, because we can also, right? We can do this on a millisecond basis, right, if you use those types of techniques. So that's where we're going. But a challenge here is that we maybe have too complex questions, as I think, I started out in, looking at what's happening when I do this with the finger, or this with the finger, when I look and when I close my eyes and stuff like that. And that's complex. But now it's like empathy, or this super complex decision making, trade marketing ideas or whatever, right? What's happening in the brain when you trade in sub bonds or whatever, right? Complex questions, and it's a complex structure. So I think that many questions that we have today might be too complex to answer, right? So I think that we should maybe take some steps back to simplify our questions, because the brain is so complex as it is, so we need to have simpler questions. Open eyes, closed eyes, maybe, I don't know, or something like that. So traditionally, how you have linked behavior and brain function is by using something that is called correlation, that you're looking at how are these two related. And one traditional approach is a between-subject correlation approach. That is that you have many subjects, and then you take one measure from each subject, from the brain and behavior, and then you sort of plot all these relations, and then you see, is it a correlation in this group, for example, intelligence or frontal lobe size, right? Are bigger frontal lobes better for intelligence or whatever, right? And then you can sort of plot them, as you see here on this in this graph here. So we are looking at strong structure-function relationships to behavior in some way, right? But the problem here is that there's a great variation, both in brain and behavior, between individuals. That is not only due to the fact that we're looking at, as for example, intelligence and brain function, but it's also due to the fact that we are typically looking at something at one point in time, right? And that point in time could be affected by many different things. Someone might be tired, bored, hungry, or whatever, right? And these things will go into the data, and that's a problem. So as for now, this is we haven't found strong and really reliable correlations in the field of cognitive neuroscience, which is one reason why there is a problem with replication also in this field, right? So it's a problem with different labs doing the same thing and finding the same things. That's one of the reasons for that anyway. So we call them cross-sectional studies then, when you look at these correlations across subjects like this. And typically it's like this, that there's a weak correlation between brain and behavior, and it's very hard to replicate these findings in independent data sets. Right? So from one lab to the next lab and to the third lab. And then it has been urged, that we need larger samples, right? Typically, a study in this field is from 30 to 70 subjects or so. It's, because it's very demanding to get this data, and it's kind of expensive and stuff like that. So that's a typical size for a group. And that doesn't really seem to work in terms of that it needs more subjects to really get the reliable data out of this comparison. So larger samples and also theory-driven hypotheses. So you typically need to know what you are looking for to really find a good reliability in the results across labs like this. And that could be difficult, right? Because all our theories comes from behavior theories, and they don't really care about the brain when they were sort of figured out these theories, and now we have the brain. So I think that it might be so that are there really all these memory systems, or is it just one memory system? Who knows, because these ideas, they are based on behavior data. But it might be so that when we look in the brain, it might be only one memory system, and then that will change theories. So theories could also bias us, looking for wrong things in the brain, so to say. Pros and cons with that. But a good thing to try to get reliable findings in this field is to use different methods and look at and have same questions. So you can use both fMRI, as for example, this activation technique where you look at where things are happening in the brain, EEG, which is another technique, and behavior tests, which is a third technique, and so on and so forth. Because if you have many different methods that sort of tells you the same story, then that is a good way of sort of getting a more reliable result than if you just have one or two methods that are measuring one thing. So that's one thing that you can move forward in that direction. But there is also an alternative approach to the group approach that I just talked about, and that is an approach where you instead look at data within subjects. So you are only looking at maybe 2 or 3 subjects, but you are measuring them maybe hundreds or thousands of times, right? Each and every subject. So by doing this, you can see that in the graphs to the right there, see that, and then you can plot data and you can follow data like this. These are like three persons doing 3 different things, and you can see that they're kind of similar. It's going up here, but they're also a bit dissimilar. But anyway, we look upon this that there are three separate studies, and we are trying to replicate each of these studies in each of these single subjects. So that's another way of doing this type of research, which is very novel in this field, but not novel in psychology. I will come back to that. It's novel in this field. And it's called a single N approach, single subject, one subject approach. So one subject is one study, two subjects are 2 studies, and so on and so forth. And then if you can find this in four unique subjects, that's massive in comparison to just find it in one subject or in just one group, right? So the advantage here that it's a much higher reliability if you look at things within subjects, and also you have a better control of variation, because what you do when you have big groups of persons, because each and every brain in this room and in all rooms are as unique as a fingerprint, right? So to compare brains across subjects, you need to warp them, morph them, so that they are similar in size. But even if you do that, they will still not be super similar, because there are also other differences in brain structure and function that are not sort of just depending on size itself, right? So you will find this variation also depending on that we have different brains. And as I said, at some time point, one is super interested, one is bored, one is novel to scanning, one has been 1,000 times. All these things go into the variation in the group, right? But you control for all these things in the single individuals. And we now have sort of professional subjects in our lab that has, that we call, it's like their job in a way, and they are very, very good at this. They are not sort of biased by, anxiety of going in the scan and stuff, because they are sort of pros on this. And that's another take. Pros and cons, of course, but that's another direction. And also, why we do this is that we think that in psychology, both cognition, as for example, memory, whatever, and emotional processing, they are true individual phenomena and should therefore also be studied as individual phenomena, because we're not interested in the group's memory, right? We're interested in the subject's memory in the group, but we typically get the group average, and that's our result, right? But that average is just an abstraction. It's not relevant for anyone in the group. So it's deeper than just a method thing for us, right? But anyway, there are 2 tracks here. And these tracks can be sort of captured in this figure here by Gratton et al. From a super nice paper from 2022, where they sort of say that there are 2 paths here that you can follow. And both are fine, but they are different. One is that you have like big studies to the left here, this red arrow, with you have large samples, large N's. Here it's called consortium studies. They are like around 1,000 subjects or more in those studies. The findings that comes out of these studies, they inform us about population tendencies, right? In humans in general, it seems like the left frontal cortex is important for X and the right frontal cortex is important for Y or whatever, right? So they are important and they are useful for guiding social policies and stuff like that. And so they are important, right? So large N is one way of moving in this field. The other way is to go for small n or single n studies that will instead give you a much higher signal-to-noise ratio in the results that you will get from these types of studies. So here they are called focus studies, and these findings inform us about effects in the individual, right? The mechanisms in the individual. You can, of course, do both, right? You can have a group, and then you can, from that group, you can pick some individuals, the good and bad performance or whatever, and then follow them, right? You can do, combine these approaches also, but they are different in the sense that we are seeing here. In 2022, also, it was another paper that came out from Marek et al., actually in the same lab as Gratton, that other person. He sort of questioned this thing with doing correlation studies in groups, and and that was based on the fact that he found out that most of the studies that has been done in the field of cognitive neuroscience, their samples are too small, which will give a misleading result, right? So the brain behavior correlations are typically very, very weak. And to get really reliable findings, you need large data sets. And then I mean large data sets. So he said more than 1,000 for sure, right? But the best is to have 2,000 or 3,000 in a study. And I know that in the field, people are like, what's this? We can't do these studies, right? So then maybe we should sort of go with all our friends in other labs and build consortia, right? So we can scan 100 and they 100, and then we sort of pool all this data and stuff. And that's of course doable, but it's very difficult, of course. But so this was a very important paper that sort of brought out the attention to that you really need large samples if you do between subject correlation studies. But he also wrote actually in the end of this paper that an alternative is to do this within subjects instead, right? And that's where we are moved in my lab. So there are 2 ways of doing this. None is right, none is wrong, but they are different, right? So what then are the risks of overstating the cross-sectional findings? That is to look across, between studies, between subjects in large studies. Typically, there's a publication bias here in this field. That is that you typically prefer the significant findings over the robust results. So robust results are if you sort of maybe replicate your own finding into separate samples, then you can be much more sure about this finding that it's something there for sure, right? Then if you just have one sample and you find something, even if that finding is very, very statistically significant, it might be wrong anyway, right? Because you need 1,000 or 2,000 subjects really to be sure. And a risk here is also then that this leads to clinical misinterpretations of the results, which means that if you see that depression seems to correlate with food intake, if you eat more bananas, in this study, then if you take that to the clinic, that's of course very, very bad if it's not true, right? So that's, you need to be super cautious about this when you're sort of taking it to the clinic. So the results need to be more robust, right? So you need to be what's called more methodologically rigid. So you must prioritize replication studies, pre-registration of your hypothesis, and also open data practices. And all this is now happening in the field, right? Because it was like a big debate about this now some years ago. Are we sort of moving into a dark alley here, or should we sort of find some light, right? And we found some lights, and these are the lights, right, that we have found. Replication, pre-registration, and open data practices. So moving forward then, what is happening and how are we thinking in the field? So we are moving away, I would say, from correlation to causation, right? We are looking, we want to know what is causing what, right, in chains of causation, rather than just saying that at one point in time, these two things sort of correlated, frontal lobes and intelligence or whatever. So here we could, as for example, use longitudinal and experimental approaches that sort of fosters causation type of analysis. As for example, AB and AB designs. In an example from our group, we have we give subjects either oxytocin or placebo, in trials within subject over time like this, and it's blinded, so no one knows what is given, not the person that gets the drug or the person that gives the drug. And then you can sort of see then over time, then AB over time, and then you can sort of look at the causation much better than if you just do it one point in time. One group get oxytocin and one get placebo, and then we are looking at differences. Not optimal, I would say. You can also track individual changes then in brain structure and activity over time. It's something now called dense imaging, which is very interesting, where you scan a lot. You're scanning every second for hours and hours within subject, and then you will get super robust results, right? Much more robust than if you do this across subject. So that's another way to move forward here, I think. And then also to focus on the causal mechanism then, rather than simple associations. Just look at associations, not really a way to move forward, I would say. And we are not the first to think about this here. This is a picture of one of my scientific heroes, Skinner. He has said many cool things, but here is one cool thing that sort of fits here. He said that it's more useful to study one animal for 1,000 hours than to study 1,000 animals for 1 hour. And that's his take. And that is something that we are following. Right? So we are not the first, but so we are standing on the shoulders of giants, of course, as always in science. Another way to move forward, I also already mentioned that, is to combine different methods, because different methods have strengths and weaknesses. But if you combine them, you can sort of get the best out of the combination of these studies. Here, as for example, fMRI is very good because it has high spatial resolution. You know where things are coming from in the brain, but it has not so good temporal resolution because you can only measure in seconds, and the brain is working in milliseconds, right? Whereas EEG, it has very good high temporal resolution, so it can measure in milliseconds, but it don't really know where signal comes from. And then you have PET. It's very good to look at neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine and serotonin and stuff, but it has low temporal and spatial resolution. So, but if you do all these things at once, then you will find a very nice pattern that you can follow. And now there are machines out there that are sort of PET MR EEG scanners that you can do all these things at once, right? Which is really cool. So that's an important move forward, I think. Another way to move forward is to use AI and big data in neuroscience. And this is an approach where we are really heading now. So there's all these tools and tasks, that are where we have used AI to sort of both analyze data, but also to sort of make the stimulation better inside the scanner, because you must realize that we are typically lying in scanners or sitting in labs, right? And this is not really ecologically valid situations. But if you do it, as for example, in a VR environment, as I know that Jonas and his group are doing a lot, then you are sort of not really in the scanner, but you are somewhere else, right? You are in the VR world, right? And so on and so forth. And you can also use AI and big data, that you collect lots and lots of data, right? And then you can use these machine learning tools to detect patterns in these complex brain behavior relations. And there are all these techniques now, like support vector machine learning and so on and so forth. And AI then can be used to uncover hidden relationships in large data sets. So I just heard a lecture by a famous neuroscientist from the US, Tor Wager, where he sort of pushes that we need to move away from maps to models, right? So maps are that you see like patterns somewhere in the brain. Okay, that's cool and interesting, but we need to find more robust patterns that you can follow over time, and that then can be applied to different populations in different cultures and so on and so forth. And to be able to do that, you need AI, right? You need these tools to really build models, because it's too complex for our brains. My brain is too weak to understand others' brains, right? So I think that's how it is. That's because we are humans and we are cool and unique, but we are also limited in that sense. So I think that we need AI to really help us to guide us in this complex environment. But we must always be aware of the fact that there are ethical concerns, right? When you use AI, a privacy concern, of course, my data is my data, and if you upload it to the public, it might be sort of, we might find out that, even though it's not a name there, okay, but this is Michael, I can see that, I don't know how, but AI is very, very complicated. So that's an issue here, right? And also biases. It could be biases in the data, right? As for example, when you used AI, in the beginning to read faces and facial expressions, this AI was built on data from white people, and typically males, right? So it was biased towards that, which means that it couldn't really read as good the facial expressions in women or in black people or in whatever, right? So that's an example of a bias. And also these things that I've been building, the automated ghosting neuroscience, is that these tools are typically black boxes, right? So you have this black box and then you apply it to your data and then you get a pattern. Wow, I believe in this pattern, right? Okay, but what is the tool really doing? Well, I don't know. So you need to sort of unghost these things, and that is something that is also happening right now. It's a lot of things now with open science and open codes, so that you can do it yourself also, right? I will try this, but but in my data to see if it works. It's not just like a press and play kind of thing anymore. But in the beginning, it was a lot like that. You know, this famous guy or girl did this. You know, so it must be true, right? But it's better to do it yourself. So then, discussion questions. How can we really improve the reliability then of brain behavior research? As I mentioned, increased sample size is one way to go, and to prioritize replication studies. And there is a great interest in that out there. So there are groups and researchers that are focused on just replicating. So they are not doing anything novel in that sense, but they are trying to replicate to really get a robustness to the field, which is super important. Not maybe as like sexy and stuff, but as important, or maybe more important, I don't know, but very important anyway. Also important, I think, to use longitudinal study designs where you follow people over time. It can be over time, you know, in terms of 10 minutes or whatever, or across, you know, years or decades or whatever. I can just mention that by doing this, we find out now some years ago that if you look at your cortical thickness in the visual cortex before and after you have looked at pictures, complex pictures, then it seems to be like a thickening of the cortex. So something is happening there. It might be neurons, you know, branching out, or something else. But by following these tracks, we could then, you know, see that this initial thickening went back if you are not really aware of what of that, you know. So it's something before and after the looking at pictures. But then if you don't look at pictures, the brain goes back to sort of normal as with muscles. But then again, if you show pictures, it will increase in size again, but faster this time. So it has learned something, right? So this is so cool by looking at within subject changes like this. And also, I think that it's very important to use multivariate tools and machine learning, as I've come to say, and so on and so forth, to enhance the predictive accuracy of this field. So the ethical implications then of using AI and big data in neuroscience. So the AI models that are then trained, if they're trained on biased data set, that might reinforce existing inequalities, right? And that's a problem if that is happening. So that's an ethical concern. That you also, this thing with the privacy is very important. Who is owning and who is controlling your data? And this is also important for point number 3 here, because this data can be used like for bad purposes, right? Your marketing or surveillance or whatever, right? Like I'm thinking like China, they have this, you know, they're measuring people, you know, where they are and their attitudes and whatever, you know, by filming them and so on and so forth. And then you get points, and these points, you know, will take you to heaven or hell, right? So yeah, that's not a good thing. So last but not least then, how can this insight enhance the treatment of mental health? Because that's really important for us in psychology and as an insight, of course, as a whole. So one avenue is to go for personalized medicine, another for non-invasive interventions, and also to look and understand resilience. In personalized medicine, you could use this, especially I would say these within subject tracks, to look at neural markers that could predict treatment outcomes and guide individualized therapies. For the non-invasive interventions, there are now techniques like neurofeedback or brain stimulation that can be used to enhance health treatment. You could put some TMS coil over the frontal lobe, as for example, in depression, and sort of activate the anterior gyrus and combining that with antidepressive treatment in some way, and then you will get like a better result than just the treatment itself, right? So you can combine these things. And then understanding the resilience is that you can look at brain behavior variability in subjects and then try to understand why are some individuals more resistant to mental disorders than others. And we have done this in social phobia and found that people that vary a lot in fMRI signal in the visual cortex and the amygdala, they are more prone to respond to CBT treatment than those that don't. So that's just an example of this. So with that, I would just say thank you for your attention, and hope that you have sort of get a ground for ground of knowledge that you will now take into the rest of the afternoon, because now it will be more on the detailed side. So, okay, thanks for me.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Håkan. Are there any questions from the audience to Håkan? Yes, Jonas?
I have one. So it's more like it's a reflection, but I think it relates to one of your points about the black box. So when I started doing my PhD work about 20 years ago, one of my colleagues got a little bit in trouble because she was working on a kind of a lie detector machine that her supervisor was developing together with some external partners. And the idea was to be able to hear in people's voices if they were lying or not. And she was doing her PhD work on this, but she had to change her subject. And the reason was that it wasn't regarded as a scientific venture, really, if you didn't know what the mechanics were or the algorithms were. These were kind of commercial. It was a commercial product that was being developed. So in a way, I thought of that recently because the generative AI tools are also black boxes, and they are used very widely in psychological research. So it seems like there is a great change how we view these black boxes as tools for research. And would you care to reflect more on what's the appropriate use of generative kind of trademarked generative AI in psychological science?
Very good question, a very difficult question. I think that as you know, what goes into these generative AIs and stuff is what is sort of building them, and you don't really know what goes into them, so it's very difficult to really have control over that. But I think that at least you should be aware of that. Whatever you do yourself, if you use these tools, it will also go into this generative AI. So, as for example, we have now studies where we are looking at patient psychotherapist interactions, right? To sort of use AI to find patterns in these conversations, but we are using them on computers that are not connected to the internet at all, because otherwise this will sort of bias, or this will be open to the public, right? These conversations, and we could now do this because of technical developments. Right? So it's because of this Chinese now, this new Chinese AI that do not require so much. What's it called? These things. it doesn't require so much power. What's that?
Processor capacity.
Processor capacity. Yeah, thank you. As these other tools, like ChatGPT and stuff like that. So that has sort of made it possible for us not to sort of go into using all this sort of black box-ish kind of AI that's out there. So maybe that, I'm just thinking, maybe that could be one thing, that if you have these sort of not so process sensitive patterns and on your single computers, then you will have control over what's in there much better than if you just put it out there to the public. So a technical development then might give you better control over what you're doing, and then you might give away that tool to others and use it, and it's biased in the same way. Now I'm just speculating because I'm not like a technical person, but that's a humble idea that comes to my head right now.
It's like in engineering, the engineering side, the more powerful models are often better, but if you want to understand the mechanics, it's smaller.
Maybe.
And that might be more appropriate for psychology.
Yeah.
That's a nice point, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It could be so.
Okay. Time for one more question. Yes?
Well, I love how I could grasp an overview of the field with your presentation. And I'm a student at a master's level here on my first year. So I'd like to know if you have some advice for young researchers how to get started.
Yeah. So, yes. So, are you here at Stockholm University?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes. No, we have a brain imaging center here at Stockholm University called SUBIC, Stockholm University Brain Imaging Center. And that's open for everyone to scan at, if you're from Linköping or wherever, or you're from Stockholm University. And you could just come there. They have open lectures all the time, and they have a really... Our idea there is that we want to make it possible for everyone in every research field to use this, right? So it's a lot of education there happening all the time. So you could just go there, talk with Rita Almeida, who is the head director, say hi from me, and then you can just start, right? So it's very low threshold into doing that type of research, I would say, here at Stockholm University. And Rita is an excellent teacher in this, and she loves to teach young, eager students. So do that.
Perfect. And that rounds up our talk today. Thank you again, Håkan.
Thank you.
And we're moving on to our digital presentation by Dr. Ian Lyons. I think we're all on board and that the technology is cooperating. Let's see. There we go. Ian, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we just have to adjust the volume.
All right. How's that?
Let's see. I think it's on our side here. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Ian. And you're a professor at Georgetown. And
That's right.
I'm going to leave the floor to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, so first of all, congratulations to Mikhail. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. Yeah, so thank you. And I wanted to begin by sort of really highlighting one of the ways that Mikhail's work is, I think, quite impactful because it is quite non-trivial to use, especially non-invasive brain imaging data to inform and really change the way we think about human behavior. This is actually a fairly major challenge that I think sometimes gets overlooked. And so I wanted to highlight the importance of his work there, and also use that to kind of set the stage for the challenge that I'm going to lay out for this talk here as well. And over the years, there's been quite a bit of what you might call neuroskepticism, sort of questioning the value, the validity of in particular, human brain imaging. You know, how much can it really tell us, especially if what we set as the goal is to inform cognitive theory, inform psychological theory, but more importantly, to tell us how and why humans behave the way they do, right? Can brain data tell us more? It's rather expensive and sometimes time consuming. Can it tell us more than a simple behavioral experiment where we just have people press buttons and so on? And it turns out that this is actually somewhat non-trivial. And now I won't belabor the entire debate, but I think it is worth bringing up again because it so often seems like one of these things that it's a bit like one of these big Twitter debates, you know, where that everybody gets very excited about it and very, very upset about it. And then it just kind of fades away. It never really impacts, has a lasting impact on the way we do things. Now, some of us it does. But I wanted to just sort of start by highlighting some of the key arguments as they're made, and use that to sort of guide, create some guide rails for what we're going to do here today, at least in this talk. And one of these is this notion of the consistency fallacy, which of course applies to all science, but for whatever reason, at least when I read a lot of human brain imaging, the discussion sections, there's just a lot of this, it would seem. And that's essentially saying that, well, you know, activity in this brain area is highly consistent with this hypothesis, or highly consistent with with this theory. And that's all fine and good, but unless you can really clearly point out the falsifiable conditions, right? These are the situations, these other very plausible ways in which my experiment could have gone, right? If that had happened, then I would be running a very different discussion section. Oh, the data were not consistent with this hypothesis or this theory or what have you, right? So brain activation, a different activity in a different brain area, a different pattern of brain activation, what have you. So really laying out what are the falsifiable conditions. Because if we don't do that, and then we just simply say, well, you know, if activity in any of the brain regions was consistent with my theory, then why not just simply write, you know, well, the sun rose in the east today, and which is highly consistent with my hypothesis. Okay, great. Now, quick sidebar for those of you who are rhetorically minded, if this sounds a little bit like affirming the consequent, that's exactly what it is. So we want to try to avoid doing that. Another related idea here is this notion of reverse inference, right? And this comes up from time to time. And what this says is that neurolocalization, while that may be useful and valuable for neuroscience, when it comes to actually explaining behavior or updating how we formulate our cognitive theories, it's not particularly useful, right? So just showing brain activation in this particular area. And part of the reason for that is this old idea that, you know, if we map out this particular brain area has this type of function. Well, that's fine, but it turns out, and I think this is actually a very remarkable set of findings that have accumulated over the course of the last couple of decades, is that any given brain area actually subserves a lot of different functions, which means that it can support a number of different types of behavior, and it can even, in some cases, support a single behavior, but in different ways as a function of how it's connected with other types of brain regions and so on and so forth, right? So in other words, just showing that I have brain activation in this particular brain area by itself doesn't actually really tell me a lot with regard to behavior, right? And so another way of thinking about that from the consistency fallacy perspective is that, well, you know, activation in that brain area is actually highly consistent with a lot of different ideas for how that brain area might be supporting a particular behavior. And then another idea that I wanted to highlight here has to do with kind of more of like an attitude or a general sort of pervasive bias. I think that, you know, I'll go to neuroscience conferences, and I want to be clear, all these criticisms apply to my own work as well, right? And, you know, I'll go to one of these neuroscience conferences, and there sometimes seems to be a little bit of an attitude like, well, because I've got, you know, if it's brain imaging, well, then of course it's informative. I've got pictures of brains, right? Now I'm obviously painting a bit of a caricature there, But there does seem to be this general sense, whether it's with policymakers or scientists ourselves, that the neuroscience is sort of de facto informative, right? The fact that it's neuroscience means that it's useful, right? But if you look across the history of the intersection, the interaction between behavioral research, whether that's animal behavioral research or human behavioral research, the number of instances where the neural data by themselves directly inform how we understand and think about, in particular, the human, human and how a human behaves, there are actually not a lot of them. There are some, but not a lot of them. Conversely, the literature is replete with examples where you have behavioral research. It says, look, here are different ways in which animals or humans behave in different contexts and so on. And that points us directly toward ideas, sort of hypotheses, strong hypotheses about different types of brain function, or at minimum, clear ideas that sort of form the foundation for what ideas then need to be tested at the neural level. And a kind of applied version of this comes from Bowers and colleagues, who sort of questioning the value of this whole educational neuroscience enterprise, which is to say that, well, look, educational questions are extremely valuable for neuroscientists. I mean, what more fascinating topic could you have than education? One of the most impactful and transformative ways in which we can change the brain, change the understanding of young individuals. I mean, even just within the math domain, it's absolutely remarkable what these children can do. I mean, before they can drive a car or in many cases vote, they are literally recapitulating, a millennium or two of some of the most advanced intellectual achievements in human history. And they just sort of do that in their 8th grade algebra class, just quite remarkable. So taking this education, what's happening in an educational classroom, an educational setting, using that to drive neuroscientific ideas is perfect. But if you then taking a lot of the above criticisms to heart, if we look for examples where the neuroscience is really giving us insights that are valuable for a teacher, they're actually quite rare. Not impossible, you can certainly find them, but they're actually rarer than you might think. So all this is to say, this sort of lays out a context where maybe it's a little bit harder than we thought to sort of use brain imaging data, which again, I think highlights the value of Mikhail's work. And we're going to try to use some of these, try to avoid some of these pitfalls in this talk here. And so in case you might not have already guessed, my view here is that I actually think that in a lot of cases, these authors had some pretty valid criticisms that yeah, we should take them seriously when we're doing some of our fancy brain imaging work. So against that backdrop, I then wanted to switch gears here and jump more into the talk itself. And so, of course, we're going to be tackling the question of how the brain does math. And I particularly enjoy this topic because it allows us to touch on a very wide range of different areas, ways and different sort of factors and contexts and settings and so forth that can be both informative and useful in terms of how we go about doing this sort of research. It's a really fascinating area to work in. And within that, of course, I'm not going to have a chance to go through an example of each of these, but I did pick out 3 of them that I think try as best I can to sort of stick by those guidelines to avoid those pitfalls that I mentioned a moment ago, and try to be also a little bit informative and maybe raise some questions and kick off some ideas here within each of these 3 different domains. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and I'll jump into the first one. And that is looking at how our understanding of neural mechanisms might inform specific cognitive mechanisms, right? Those sort of cognitive building blocks of really sort of basic foundational math skills. And one of the most foundational math skills is this notion of arithmetic fluency, right? So of course, just arithmetic, sums, your multiplication tables, and so on. They really form a lot of the foundations of a lot of how most of us end up doing math. I understand that mathematicians often are not just sort of really working with numbers and so on. But of course, for 99% of us, most of our interactions with math do involve numbers, and arithmetic fluency, our ability to sort of very quickly and rapidly know the answers to basic arithmetic questions, basic arithmetic problems, sort of forms the foundation of a lot of our other math skills. And against this, I want to highlight this notion, this broader notion that math is a skill, it's not magic. For the vast majority of us, we have to work pretty hard to sort of obtain our basic math skills, and we have to work pretty hard to maintain them, just like any other skill, right? So if you learned, it's probably pretty difficult to learn how to play that musical instrument. A lot of music lessons and a lot of going to these music lessons when you weren't particularly keen to do so, when you were 8 years old. But nevertheless, you persevered, and now you can play the flute, you can play the piano, play the violin. But if you leave it be for 10, 20 years, well, those skills get pretty rusty. And exactly the same is true with respect to most math skills, especially arithmetic fluency. But from the skill-based perspective, one of the things that this highlights is that, well, it should be resting on memory systems, right? What are the underlying memory mechanisms that store and refine these skills? So that's the kind of specific context, right? These are the cognitive mechanisms, the cognitive building blocks that we're going to be looking at. And in this case, it's going to be arithmetic fluency. And the sort of specific question that I want to address here is, why in general are we better at arithmetic problems that involve what we call smaller operands, right? So just to kind of give an example, so 2 times 2, 2 times 3, we tend to be very good at those. Whereas we are less good, comparatively speaking, at something like 7 times 8, 7 times 9. So in other words, as the numerical size of an operand, of the operands involved increase, our performance gets worse. Now, what I've plotted here on the y-axis is reaction time, which is basically just showing that people are taking longer to respond, right? So people are becoming a little less efficient to respond for those larger operands. And we see this across a wide range of things, whether that's accuracy. We also see this in brain activity, right? So these smaller operands tend to show a lower degree of brain activity with increasing brain activity for the higher operands. We refer to this as the problem size effect. But the big question I want to address here is why? Where does this come from? Why are we actually better at these? Can looking at the underlying memory mechanisms give us some traction, give us a better understanding? And so there are a couple of proposed ideas, hypotheses in the literature out there, right? One is that there's reduced variability in the problem strategies. So the way in which we do 2 times 3 and the way in which we do 2 times 2, it's the same basic strategy. Let's say we just retrieve that from memory. I just know it. I just sort of retrieve that. Well, those 2 strategies are very similar, whereas when we get to larger problems, there's a much more varied range of strategies. I might use different sort of tips or tricks and so on and so forth that I learned over the years in school or in other contexts. And so we'll get to sort of more variability as the problem size increases. Another is that, well, it's actually only 1 or 2 strategies that drive most of our performance here. But really what's going on is that in memory, we're representing those smaller numbers much more precisely, whereas we're less precisely able to encode and retrieve those larger numbers, and that's what's actually driving the performance difference. So what's the answer here, right? Well, it's hard to do this with behavioral data because what we're actually trying to explain here is the behavioral data themselves. So we want to avoid circularity there. And as I mentioned, certain types of brain imaging are actually just simply mirror the behavior data. So we might need a slightly different approach. The approach we're going to take here is a similarity-based approach. Sorry, get this to, there we go. We use a similarity-based approach. And I'm going to kind of broadly, for the sake of, one could do this continuously, but for the sake of trying to explain this, I think, quickly, I'm going to sort of categorize these into what you might call small problems, numerically small problems, and numerically large problems. So our reduced variability view would suggest that, again, that the neural pattern for 2 times 2 and 2 times 3, those patterns should be quite similar, right? Because, again, we're using only 1 or 2 strategies. So the variability of the strategies is much lower. Conversely, we should see much less similarity for 7 times 8 and 7 times 9 because there's way more strategies that we could be using across those different problem types. But the very nice thing about this approach is that the precision view makes precisely the opposite prediction, right? So because we're representing 2 times 2 and 2 times 3 very precisely, those should be much more separable in terms of the underlying brain pattern. So we should see less similarity. Conversely, because of the lack of separability between 6 times 8 and 6 times 9 and 7 times 9 and so on, we should be seeing increased similarity, right? So that our underlying representation is less precise, more overlapping, so more similarity in that case, right? So the very nice thing about this is that we have directly opposing predictions, right? So kind of that falsifiability idea is sort of built in. It's always nice to have just sort of directly opposing. If you can formulate an experiment where you have opposing predictions, you kind of get to build that into to what you're doing, and thus to the possibilities that you might find. So very briefly, we're going to look across a wide range of brain areas. So rather than focus on a specific brain area, we're going to look across a wide range. Is this the overall pattern? What is the overall pattern that we see across a range of areas that prior work, including this data set, indicate? These are areas that are systematically activated when people are doing both large and small problems. So the question is, what is the underlying pattern? So if you're sort of rooting for the reduced variability hypothesis, then essentially what you're rooting for here is greater similarity in small versus large. You're rooting for big green bars. But if you're on greater precision, team greater precision, then you're rooting for big orange bars, right? Just sort of really break it down and make it very simple. And sometimes it can be really helpful to have just those obviously opposing hypotheses. We don't have to get complicated about it. And in this case, we can use the famous binocular significance test. Just look at the data. It's pretty obvious. In this case, it's the greater precision seems to be carrying the day. And if you prefer a more formal test, then here you are. These are the formal tests. And if you look at that dashed line down at the bottom there, that is our significance level for any given brain region. And the fact that we're showing 21 of the 22 brain regions are significant at that level. The odds of finding that by random chance are 1 times 10 to the negative 26. So, yep, I think our binocular significance tests seem to be pretty solid there. And the bottom line here, though, is that what this is, I think, showing us is that pretty clearly what's driving, at least for multiplication, what's driving that problem size effect, why are we better at those small numbers? It's because we're representing them more precisely in memory, right? That seems to be what's happening. So what are the implications of this, right? What are the implications of this more precise representation, right? So this memory-based view of arithmetic. Well, another domain where arithmetic fluency is highly relevant is in old age, right? As people age, right? The different sort of, it seems like as we get older, right? The various sort of bureaucratic things that we need to deal with seem to only increase, and we still have a need for financial literacy, and in particular health literacy, what we might call health numeracy, and especially in the U.S., right, with their very complicated and Byzantine insurance system, our ability to sort of just deal with basic numerical facts can be quite valuable here. But what this memory view leads us to is the notion that perhaps actually it may be the simplest arithmetic problems, right? 2 times 2 equals 4, the ones that we're relying most heavily on for memory retrieval. These might actually show the greatest decline. And the reason for that, what I'm showing you here is just a general schematic of the changes in different brain systems as people age. So generally speaking, as people get older, right, this decline in declarative memory is quite steep. All right, so declarative memory, what is the capital of Sweden? What is the capital of the United States, right? So the ability to directly retrieve that, it would seem most relevant for sort of retrieving 2 times 2. Conversely, procedural memory, how do you ride a bike? And in arithmetic, sort of the rapid concatenation of those different calculation procedures. Right? That would be something that we would expect to be a little bit more preserved in old age. So this sets up the idea that it's actually those simplest problems that are actually going to be showing the biggest declines with age. And so here you can see that when I say simplest, yes, indeed, across this age range, 2 times 2, that is what people are able to perform most rapidly. And so here I'm actually breaking this down even further, right, beyond just the small versus large distinction. Squares, or what we might call ties of 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, we're very familiar with those. We do those a lot. We have a lot of practice with those, you know, I think from a skill-based perspective. And those are the ones we tend to be very, very good at. But presumably, those are the ones that we are relying most heavily on direct memory retrieval in order to compute. So even though these are the ones that on average we're performing the best, those are the ones we would predict to show the greatest declines with memory. And here you can see this sort of almost opposite gradient. So as the problems get simpler, the association with age increases. Now this is an association where older age is associated with increasing reaction times, sort of less efficient performance. And this is just a simple zero order correlation, but we see it much more even more starkly when we look at what's called a partial correlation. That's where we remove a bunch of sort of demographic factors like socioeconomic status, as well as other sort of basic cognitive processes like executive functioning, processing speed, and we of course control for the influence of the other types of problems. This is a pretty strict test, and you can see that in this case, quite clearly, we're seeing the most rapid decline in the simplest problems, the 2 times 2s. So for that reason, I want to sort of focus in on that and sort of think about how that relates to this aging question. And here I'm going to turn briefly to some brain data. In this case, I'm going to look at a structure called the hippocampus. In the hippocampus, I want to look at this for a couple reasons. One, because we know the hippocampus actually shows pretty precipitous declines with age, especially in the case of neurodegenerative diseases, but even to an extent in healthy aging as well. And here we're going to look to try and avoid, to an extent, some of the reverse inference, not completely evade the reverse inference issue. We're going to look at specific subcomponents within the hippocampus. And in this case, we're going to look at CA1, which is especially relevant for direct memory retrieval. And in fact, in animal literature, disruptions of this brain region can lead to memory retrieval failure. And so that's why we're going to sort of look more specifically at the decline in CA1 versus the decline in other subcomponents within the hippocampus, right? To try and be as precise as we can here. And so just to kind of lay everything out somewhat visually, right? So here we have our association between age and our performance on those. The ST stands for small ties. Sorry, I didn't define that previously, right? Those very, very simple arithmetic problems. And here we're going to try to look and see, does the explanatory path for this association, does it run primarily through CA1 or the other subcomponents, CA2 and 3, the other subcomponents of hippocampus? Of course, just to unpack mediation, the logic of mediation just a little bit here, what that implies is that we need to see an association between age and CA1, and indeed we do see this. Sorry, I'm not showing you the data here, but we do see pretty precipitous declines as age increases, the volume and the function of CA1, as well as CA2-3, both of those decrease. But which of those then is most uniquely predictive, that is to say controlling for one another, the influence of one another, is uniquely predictive of small ties? Right, so we take each of these factors and we combine them into what we call a mediation effect, which is another way of saying, so you can say, in this case, you can say mediates. If CA1 volume mediates this association, we can say that statistically speaking, it explains that association. And in particular, in this case, it explains 23%, which happens to be a significant proportion, just under a quarter of that association. And again, this is a highly specific effect. And finally, to address that falsifiability piece of it, I want to look at a few other candidate regions, right? So when we take CA1 and we put it up against several other brain regions, many of which also show precipitous age-related declines, things like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? As well as parietal cortices that we know from other work is often activated in the case of arithmetic processing, math processing, right? So you can see here that these pink bars, this is the CA1 effect. It's largely unperturbed. It's the inclusion of these other brain regions has almost no impact on the CA1 effect. conversely, none of these are showing significant effects, right? So really showing the specificity here and sort of trying to address that falsifiability side of the coin. And sort of briefly summarizing here, this is what we set out to do, right? We set out to sort of test these two different hypotheses, use brain data to adjudicate between these two different explanations for why we behave the way we do. We came down in favor of the greater precision, the memory-based view, and that led us to some interesting predictions that we were able to test, having to do with how aging relates to the decline, in this case, of specific types of arithmetic skills. So perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, it's actually the decline of those simplest problems because of the decline in the declarative memory brain systems. So with that, I'll pause take a brief pause here, catch our breath, because then we're going to shift gears, sort of shift all the way over to the other side. And here I want to talk about affect and attitudes, right? So the emotional side of math, right? And in particular, the emotion that I want to focus on here is anxiety, right? That sense of anxiety, right? So it turns out that math can be emotional, right? So even though math seems like this sort of bastion of sort of like cold, deductive logic, which in some ways it is, but nevertheless, the way that people experience, the way that many people approach math is actually quite emotional, and for quite a few people, it can be quite anxiety-inducing. And unfortunately, for some individuals, this high degree of anxiety that's specific to math, we call this math anxiety, this can actually be deleterious for their math performance. And this is a quite robust result, right? So this is just one data set showing this, but there are several meta-analyses now showing that this is a very robust result spanning back several decades, that people who report having higher degree of math anxiety, they indeed perform more poorly on math. Right. And so this has kicked off quite a bit of research into understanding the why of this. So why exactly does math anxiety lead to poor math performance? And one of the sort of most obvious views here is that, well, probably has something to do with the fact that they're anxious, right? I mean, it seems a bit obvious, but it seems like a reasonable place to start. And what I mean by that is typically when people sort of tell us that they're math anxious, we have them fill out some sort of questionnaire, and at least in our lab, we'll have them fill out this questionnaire, and then a few days later, we'll bring them into the lab. They usually don't know what they're going to be doing in the lab, but then we have them do some math tasks. And it turns out that in general, that how they responded on this math questionnaire, higher math anxiety, lower performance, it is predictive. The question then is, well, okay, they told us that they were going to feel anxious when they were doing math. Do they actually? And furthermore, is it that anxiety feeling that in turn explains their decrement in math performance, right? So it's in that way that is it that in the moment feeling of anxiety, that emotional response that is actually driving the decrease in performance. And here again, we can use a mediation framework. It turns out that, and this is work by, shoot, I meant to be mentioning this, and I'm so sorry. The prior work that I was talking about, that was initially some work done by Karenza Tiberhin in collaboration with Wim Fias at Ghent University, along with Jana, and then the aging stuff was with Jana Rijfegerste at Georgetown University, and Michael Ullman there as well. This is work that was spearheaded by my former PhD student, Rich Dacre. So this is Rich's work, but I will take responsibility for any misconstruals of it for certain. So needless to say, Rich did find that that state-related anxiety did explain at least a portion of that decline in performance, right? And so here I'm kind of trying to visually show that percentage that I just showed it, sort of gave you a percentage there before. I'm sort of visually showing this. So this AB effect, that's our mediation effect. And C is what we were trying to explain before. C prime is sort of what's left over, right? What did we fail to explain? You can see that we captured about half, right? A little over half. I think it works out to about 52% of that original explanatory. That's what we're explaining here of that original association. So pretty good, pretty darn good. But one question is, can we do better, right? Because it's like, well, you would think that like how a person's actually feeling, like that should be it. Like this should be the beginning and the end of it. So on the one hand, half seems pretty good, but I kind of would have expected a bit better. And that's how we framed this, and that's how Rich framed it in the paper. It was like confirmation of a long-standing hypothesis, but maybe not as resoundingly consistent with that hypothesis as we might have thought. So what are the other mitigating factors that are not consistent with that hypothesis? And so here I want to point out that this is the average person with math anxiety, right? So perhaps there might be different types of math anxious individuals, ways in which they're responding to this challenge of anxiety. And does that give us some traction into how and why they end up performing well or not so well in math? And in this case, I'm going to turn to neural data, but in this case, I'm going to talk about the autonomic or the peripheral nervous system, right? So there's, of course, your brain, which sits inside your head. We often refer to that as your central nervous system. And then there's your peripheral nervous system, which is kind of the rest of your brain, or the extension of your brain. Those are all the innervation of your muscles, as well as almost like a secondary mini brain that operates within your heart that sort of controls a lot of cardiovascular functioning. And in particular, I want to zero in on the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, and specifically the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm going to oversimplify for the interest of time here, but parasympathetic nervous system, you can kind of think of this as the brakes. So sympathetic is, I see a bear, I'm about to take a math test, and I am not prepared for this math test. I'm not excited about dealing with this bear, so I am going to run away, fight, what have you, upregulate that stress response. Okay, let's say I successfully evaded the bear. I finished the math test. I think it went okay, maybe not as well as I would have hoped, but not too terribly. Okay, let's take a breath and let's bring it back down, right? Let's apply the brakes. A lot of that is your parasympathetic responsivity, your parasympathetic nervous system that is helping to apply those brakes, right? Slightly oversimplifying here, but I think that for our purposes, that's reasonable. Now, this is not emotion regulation per se. And I will say we actually did have a behavioral metric of emotion regulation, and that did not achieve what I'm about to show you here, whereas it was this neural metric of parasympathetic neural responsivity, which is related to emotion regulation, but it's really more about regulation of these sort of peripheral processes, these autonomic processes that are happening outside of, in many cases, conscious awareness. And so if we bring to bear parasympathetic responsivity here, and in this case, then we can ask, does our mediation effect depend on how well a person is able to apply the brakes when they're in this stressful situation, or what to them is a stressful situation, right? And so here, low parasympathetic responsivity, not able to apply the brakes quite so well. And for these individuals, and I've rarely seen a mediation effect like this. This is quite remarkable. When Rich showed me these data, I was like, go back and run it again, because I'm not sure I believe that. And he did, and he ran it, 10 different ways. And okay, I guess that's pretty clear. This is capturing over 90% of the original relationship, which is pretty rare in mediation, especially in kind of the behavioral sciences. So needless to say, what we were able to show here is for the individuals who are not able to apply the brakes quite so well, that feeling of anxiety seemed like a bit of a runaway train, and it really did seem to be somewhat catastrophic. So it really did crater their performance. But interestingly enough, for the individuals who had high parasympathetic responsivity, they were able to apply the brakes pretty well. We saw pretty much the opposite. Explained only, I think it works out to about 15%, maybe a little less, of that original association, suggesting an entirely different mechanism. And I say a different mechanism because the other thing to keep in mind here, so this is for the high parasympathetic group, right? They are still showing decrements in performance. So they told us they were high in math anxiety, and that high math anxiety was predictive of poor performance. But as far as we could measure, that had nothing to do with how they were actually feeling in that moment, at least with respect to their anxiety and stress response. Something else is going on here. And here's that okay, consistent with, but what are we missing? What are these other factors, right? What else could be explaining why at least some highly math anxious individuals are performing poorly? And so here I want to consider a few other potential hypotheses, and this is very much work that is sort of in preparation. For the moment, it's me here, Lions et al., but I'm trying to convince one of my lab members to take it on and sort of take it across the finish line. But I think that the data, even in preliminary form, I think are hopefully you'll agree, are reasonably convincing. So here we're trying to explain this math anxiety to math performance association. And we've already seen that partly this is explained by the fact that they do feel more anxious. But it could be several of these other possible explanations, right? So that anxiety is actually compromising executive functioning, working memory resources, their ability to sort of do that complicated math task. They may just have poor numerical foundations, right? Just didn't do a great job of practicing those numerical basics early on, and that's wrong footing them when it comes to doing somewhat more complex math. And the last one is maybe they just avoid math, right? Which is not unrelated to the practice question, but avoidance, it turns out, can actually operate on a number of different timescales, which we're not unpacking here. That's something I'd be happy to chat about at another time. But maybe they're just, hey, this anxiety, and we know that anxiety is associated with avoidance behavior in other domains. So they're anxious and they're just like, I want no part of this, whether that's practicing math offline or when they come to do the math, they just sort of disengage. And they're like, yeah, I don't want to do this. This is not for me. It's the amount of effort they put in, the attentional allocation, it's just not there, right? So maybe that could be another explanation. And so we're going to look at each of these in what we call a competing mediation framework. As I mentioned, we have some evidence for the first of these, and we can ask about the other three. First, we just need to, are these associated with math anxiety? And at least a few of them are, right? This is just math performance. We knew this was the case. And here we sort of already knew this was the case from before. But we're seeing other candidate mediators, right? So working memory didn't really seem to be doing much here. But basic numeracy and avoidance seem like they might have a shot here at some explanatory capacity. So then when we look at the actual mediation effects, we can see that indeed, so anxiety hangs out there, but so does numeracy and so does avoidance. And these are unique mediations. So this is controlling for the influence of the others as well, right? So this is a highly specific test. And if we look at the actual proportions explained, we see nothing really explained here, very, very little explained here by working memory, but about 20%. Now that's a reduction from half that we saw before, but that's because we're now considering these other factors. And we bring them together, we're now able to do better than half, almost 2/3. So thus by considering these different factors, we can start to unpack, well, what were we missing, right? What were the other elements that we might have thought about? And hopefully this is starting to paint a bigger picture for why some individuals, so math anxious individuals in general are performing worse on math tasks, but the specific explanations for why may vary a bit. And it's that neural marker, if you will, that may help us understand who's who, right? For whom does this type of intervention, is this type of intervention more likely to work versus that type of intervention? Maybe give us some traction in that space. So that's that one. I think I'm getting close-ish to time here, so I will, and I can fortunately do this last one, I think, pretty quickly, if that's okay with everybody. But again, take a breath. So we talked about the math fluency, arithmetic fluency, and then we talked about attitudes, in particular anxiety, the emotional side of things. And now let's talk about abstract representation, right? So this is one of the things that we do a lot in math, right? We do a lot of abstraction in math. And in this case, I want to tackle that very process of taking a kind of perceptually grounded sense of quantity, right? There are more berries on this bush. There are more monkeys in their tribe than there are in our tribe, right? That we share this sort of basic perceptual ability to sort of perceptually to perceive these basic quantities in our environment with a lot of different animal species. But how do we humans then turn them into these abstract symbolic representations? And one of the things I want to point out here, and I'm not going to belabor all the evidence here in the interest of time, but number symbols really are different, whether we look at neural evidence, behavioral evidence, or in some cases developmental evidence. The number symbols, the way that we represent number symbols really is fundamentally different from these underlying perceptual quantities. And the reason I bring that up here is that means that this process by which we go from these perceptual quantities, right? So roughly how many bugs are there here? You know, how many strawberries are there here? How many jelly beans are in the jar? We go from that approximate sensory-based sense of you know, how many you know, quantity, and turn that into an abstract symbolic representation. That is a non-trivial process. That requires some form of conversion, and that's what we want to understand. That is that conversion process here. That's what we're going to try to tackle. And just to highlight the importance of this, right? So this is a LiDAR map from a self-driving car, right? So this is an important process for we humans, but it's also a very important computational problem, right? So in order to do all those fancy computations that allow one to sort of to predict where pedestrians might be, where other cars are going to be, and so on and so forth, we have to take this incoming sensory data and essentially digitize it. Right now, humans aren't necessarily digitizing it in the same way as computers are, but we are nevertheless converting this sensory-based sense of quantity into an abstract representation. So the way we're going to isolate this, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the methodology here. I've sort of glossed the methodology a little bit in the interest of, let's say, interest, as well as time. But here I want to spend a bit of time on the methodology, simply because I think it highlights how and why brain imaging is valuable here. So what we had people do is we really tried to break this down into the portion where they're going to extract the quantity, then the conversion process, and then the compare and respond. And we're going to eliminate the extraction process as best we can, eliminate the compare and response process, and really just zero in on that conversion piece, which we're now removing from the underlying behavior. And thus, by definition, this is something that behavior can't give us access to. So I think this is one of the most powerful ways that we can use brain imaging, is to say, what can behavior not do? Let's use brain imaging to do that insofar as it can. So that's what we're going to try to do. Our particular approach here is to look at the underlying distributed pattern of activity, and then across a range of brain areas that we know are involved in both sensory-based processing of quantity as well as abstract representation of symbolic quantity. And we're going to ask, is this conversion process additive, subtractive, or both? What the heck do I mean by that? Give me 1 second. Here's what we're going to do. So we're going to sort of zero in on this particular paradigm. First, we're going to confirm that indeed this is how people are executing this task. They are converting in this process. And we do this actually through behavioral evidence, where we can show, and in the interest of time, I won't belabor this too much, but we can show that essentially performance on this version of the task is different from this version of the task. And that allows us to confirm that indeed they are converting here the symbol, converting this into a symbol in this process, and then they hold that symbolic representation in mind while they wait to see the second number and then actually perform the comparison that they're going to do. And I should mention that in each one of these cases, they know exactly what's happening. They know in this block of trials, you're going to be doing this pattern versus this pattern, or if you will, this other type of pattern, right? So they're holding this number in mind. We need to remove the fact that this is essentially a short-term memory task. Let's get rid of that. Okay, we're going to control for that using a non-numerical shape matching task. You know, hold in mind this shape, and then a moment later, is this the same or a different shape? But also, very importantly, we need to remove that extraction component, right? So in this task, here you go, here's a perceptual quantity. In a moment later, you're going to compare it to another perceptual quantity. Okay, they don't have to convert anything here, right? So that, by removing that, we can eliminate this extraction piece and really hopefully isolate that conversion process, right? And so what are we going to actually do with that? Well, what we really want to do here is demonstrate that this conversion process, or try to see whether or not this conversion process contains any elements of the target, right? Presumably they're converting this into a symbol. Well, then there should be a degree of similarity with this context where we show them a symbol and they know that they don't have to do any conversion because they're just going to compare that symbol with another symbol. So this after controlling for all this other stuff, right, is this actually going to show us some similarity with, if you will, the target of the conversion? And this is the additive component because, again, this is something that is not present in the original stimulus, and we've removed all of that other stuff that it could have been, right? So if there's similarity here, then this is something that was not present there. I've converted it into a new representation that we can then measure and address the similarity with in a different context where we know no conversion is necessary. So do we find evidence of this? Again, binocular significance tests, we sure as heck do, right? So these pink bars are capturing similarity. This dashed line here is our sort of baseline significance level, probability of finding 15 of the 17 regions with a significant effect here is, I'll read my notes, 3.8 times 10 to the negative 18th. That's the probability of finding that by chance alone. So binocular significance test, you pass. What about subtractive? In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of zoom through this one. So apologies if I do this too quickly. The subtractive element here, so we know that these perceptual quantities are, they very strongly encode numerical size. So kind of similar to that size effect before, they very, very strongly encode this sense of numerical size. When we convert, do we maintain that size in the converted representation, or is that size lost, right? Is it subtractive? Is it a subtractive component? And it turns out it is lost, right? So here our significance are these dashed lines, and you can see that not a single brain region is showing an effective numerical size in that conversion signature, really suggesting that for what is gained, there is also something that is lost here. In other words, the numerical conversion process, right, the sort of baseline ability to sort of take something out of the perceptual domain and bring it into that abstract symbolic domain, that involves both gains and losses, right? Which kind of makes a certain amount of sense, right? When I convert something from a fraction into a decimal, there are gains. It's a lot easier to do addition and subtraction, I would argue, with using decimals, but there are some losses, right? It's much easier to divide by a fraction in my mind, right? You just flip it, right? So imagine dividing by 0.18. What? I don't even know. How do I do that, right? And usually I just convert it back into a fraction and then flip the thing, right? Or have a calculator. Anyhow, what is gained is sometimes, we have gains and losses when we convert any representation. And we see that here. So here, just a brief summary page. I'm not going to run through and belabor this all again, but I will leave a version of this up in just a moment. But I did want to take just a moment to thank all the different co-authors and collaborators across these different projects. I've highlighted here the lead authors in several of these different projects. And the one person I want to highlight, this is the person for that last one, the abstract representation. That's Mike Slepenki. He is currently a postdoc in my lab. He is brilliant and he needs a job. So, so if you've got a job out there and you liked what Mike was doing, and he's done a lot of other very cool stuff as well, and hopefully I did a reasonable job of, hopefully I didn't embarrass Mike here. Again, any problems with the presentation are on me, not on me. But anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'll go ahead and open this up here for questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for that wonderful talk, and I think it was a really important contribution, highlighting how cognitive neuroscience can inform psychological theories and mechanisms. So really great talk. We're running out of time, but we have time for maybe one question from the audience. Anyone? No? All right. So let's see. Jonas.
Thank you, Ian, for a wonderful talk. So it seems like there's a large set of regions representing numerical quantities, and you didn't go so much into detail about the individual regions, but it's sort of like a matrix of regions. I wonder, that system, how is that different from abstract concept representation? So the numerical versus verbal concepts. What are the similarities and differences in the encoding properties of those domains?
That's a fantastic question. My hunch, and bear in mind that this is a hunch, is that they actually show a good amount of similarity, both literally and figuratively. There's actually a bit of work. There's not been a ton of work, brain imaging work, looking at sort of abstract logical reasoning. But when you do look at the brain regions involved, they look a lot like our math brain regions, right? Now, that is bald-faced reverse inference, right? And so that's why I say this is very tentative. But then also some work by folks like Kinga Morsani at Loughborough suggests that at the behavioral level, there is quite a bit of connection between numerical and in this case, abstract logical reasoning as well. And so we are actually running a study that doesn't directly address this, but we will be able to look and see across a wide range of different types of cognitive tasks, and sort of embed them in what you might call a sort of a network-based perspective, and sort of understand as best we can, both within a brain region, right, that brain similarity, as well as a network-based representation. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the similarity across these different domains, and how each brain region is representing each of these different brains, and then you look to see, okay, where are the brain regions, how well across the brain areas do we see kind of this network level alignment? Not at all dissimilar to what Mikhail has done. Are we able to then sort of get a little bit of traction here, and then from that you can then start to test some specific hypotheses about, what is driving this similarity? Is it, abstract reasoning, a degree of similarity between abstract reasoning and sort of numerical representation per se? My prediction is yes, but again, that's a prediction that at the moment rests on, at least at the brain level, essentially, bald-faced reverse inference. So we shall see.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And it's too bad for us that you couldn't be here in person, which was the original plan, but so happy to have you over Zoom at least, and thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And let's keep in touch in the future, and get well soon also.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kenny, and thank you for the invitation.
All right. Thank you, Ian.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I'd like to thank for the invitation to have the opportunity to present some data. And I want to congratulate you for your prize, and have to tell you who's the person who has chosen him? Oh, there, you have chosen the right one. I can say. So in my presentation, I will focus on dyscalculia and try to unravel the brain struggle with numbers. To my person, I'm part of the Center of Magnetic Resonance Imaging at the University Children's Hospital of Zurich. And I can tell you we just had a major struggle behind us as well, because we moved with the entire hospital and the entire research department to a new place in Zurich. And now we have a beautiful new research building where all the research is condensed. And on the opposite of the street, we have like the hospital for the children's, where also our MR scanner is located, and everything is really inviting, like this beautiful room here as well. It reminds me a little bit of our hospital as well. A lot of wood, very welcoming, and a lot of atriums and fresh light. So it's really nice to be at the new place, but it was really a major task for all of us. So that you have a little bit of background where I'm coming from and I'm working. And the findings that I'm going to present, of course, are not just my own work, but my team's work, and you see here some of them. I mean, students are coming and going, but currently these are the people that stands with me in the lab and do some research. And mainly in our lab, we focus on the neuronal basis of numerical cognition. We also look at the development of numerical cognition, as we are at the Children's Hospital, of course. But I'm also interested in daily life relations to math, for instance, how people or how numeracy affects their financial decision taking or risk taking in financial decisions. We try to translate our really basic findings also into practice. For instance, we developed a screener to detect children. We have different studies on math anxiety, as you already heard before from Ian as well. We have been involved in the development and evaluation of different intervention studies for children with math problems. And we are also interested in other aspects that are related to numeracy, like visual spatial skills. And for today, I wanted to give you first an overview about dyscalculia, what is developmental dyscalculia, and then really jump into the neuronal basis of the brain. I will start with a quick overview how our brain is calculating and processing numbers, and then give you some insights how it looks in the brains of children with developmental dyscalculia. So let's start. What is developmental dyscalculia? We know it's a specific impairment that affects arithmetic skills, and these kids or people are completely average in IQ, so they don't have any general cognitive developments, issues in development, but just math and numbers is a real problem to understand for them. The difficulties start with learning numeracy, so early on. And the picture we usually see in these patients is quite heterogeneous, so not all of them have at the same features of number processing difficulties like the other one, but often they struggle with very basic numerical understanding. They use a lot of counting and use their fingers, for instance. That's something we see a lot. And typically they have also associated problems. For instance, some of them have visual spatial deficits, others have problems in working memory or other executive functions like inhibition. We know from different studies that it is a persisting learning disability, so it doesn't just grow out. If you just say, let's wait, the child will learn it maybe a bit later. When it's dyscalculia, this is definitely the wrong strategy to follow. And the prevalence is pretty high, it's around 6%, so in each classroom is approximately one child affected of developmental dyscalculia, and particularly the ones that have severe problems in numeracy are likely to be more girls than boys. Moreover, dyscalculic children often have other comorbidities like problems in reading and writing like dyslexia, or also attentional deficits like ADHD. And because of their continuous failure in math lessons, for instance, they often develop secondary symptoms like math anxiety, as you heard before, but also depressive symptoms, aggressive behavior, or even school refusal. And I have brought you a little video of a dyscalculic adolescent, and if you could click on the video, then you can hear and see what she's telling us.
Hi Dyscalculia Network family, it's Ines here today. I thought in honour of World Mental Health Month we could discuss how my learning disability can affect my mental health. Dyscalculia presents itself in a variety of ways, including numerical processing and many other symptoms. Being a student, this obviously means I have to take maths exams, and I have to work twice as hard as the average student in order to achieve the same grades. Being given a grade that doesn't reflect the amount of work I put into it can be detrimental to my self-esteem and mental health. This obviously affects me negatively, so I thought I'd share this so that my neurotypical peers, or even those who just simply don't relate to my struggles, can be more mindful and supportive to those with dyscalculia or other learning disabilities. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
So, as she pointed out, I mean, they have to work really twice or 3 times, 4 times as hard to achieve nearly the level of a typically developing child, or a grade, as she said. And of course, they develop lower self-esteem. They think I'm too lazy, I'm not intelligent enough, and so on, which is obviously not true. What are the causes of developmental dyscalculia? Honestly, it's not completely understood. But nowadays, we think it's a kind of combination of different factors. On the one hand, there's a genetic predisposition. So if a parent is dyscalculic, the chance is higher that the child gets dyscalculia as well. Or if a sibling has dyscalculia, the chance is 8 to 10 times higher that the other sibling might develop numerical problems as well. However, the environment seems to play an important role as well. How the kids are stimulated to learn numbers, how they are taught with math, and so on. Language is another issue, for instance. The language system we have for numbers differs. For instance, in German, we have like an inversion. We say first the units and then the tens, like 21. And in English, you don't have it. It's 21. I don't know how it is in Swedish, whether you have this inversion as well or not. But these are kind of difficulties for people with dyscalculia, or let's say French is even worse. 99, you hardly have to calculate until you know what number is meant. And me as a neuroscientist, I'm interested in the neuronal background of this learning disability, and as I will show you later, there are a lot of findings pointing to neurodevelopmental differences in affected people. And just by the way, just a few days ago, on the 3rd of March, there was the International Dyscalculia Awareness Day. Mm-hmm. So imagine you have a child, you see the child developing. Can you already see if this child maybe will develop dyscalculia? And what I can tell you is that there are already first hints in preschool age. For instance, they have error or make errors in counting and comparing, like these wooden blocks, for instance. They have problems in estimating small quantities. Incorrect numbers are assigned to quantities, or just simple calculations. Let's say 1 block plus 2 blocks equals 3 blocks. Things like this is just not possible. And in school, the characteristics change a bit, of course, and usually that's where they really come apparent. The problems they have counting, make counting errors, particularly counting backwards is a major task for them, or a problem. They have number twisters and number transcoding problems. I have brought you some example here. This is a case study, a girl, 7 years, first grade. She had to write numbers, and you see that, yeah, she wrote it in a wrong way, for instance. Then that's another case study, also a girl, a little bit older, 8 years, 3rd grade. And for instance, here, I gave this number orally, 503. She had to write it down. You see that she did not really understand the numerical system yet, how to transcode like this orally given numbers in a written Arabic digit. Then the transitions of tens and hundreds are very difficult for people with dyscalculia. Even very simple calculation problems have to be recalculated again and again. They calculate usually by counting, using their fingers. They have absolutely no feeling about the size of a number or a quantity. And here I have brought you another example. This is now a boy, 11 years, 5th grade. And I have shown him, for instance, these dots for 2 seconds, and he had to estimate how many dots he saw. Here he estimated 10, which gave no point because it was underestimated. With this number of balls, he estimated 900. With this number of buckets, he estimated 10,000. It was just, oh, a lot of buckets, 10,000 is a big number, but he has no clue, no sense about the size of these actual numbers. And they also struggle with other domains that are connected to math. For instance, dealing with time, learning, the clock, for instance, dealing with money, estimating length or quantities, all these things can be problematic for dyscalculic children. And there's another case study. It's a girl, 10 years, 3rd grade. She had to connect like different objects to length. For instance, this means car length of a car. She estimated between 50 centimeters and 100 centimeters. Or this is the length of her arm. She estimated more than a meter. So you see just an example of problems in like size perception as well. How does it change in adulthood? Does it look differently or still the same? And I can tell you that like these major problems that I've shown you in school age, they are more or less the same that we can find in adolescents or adults as well. However, of course, more demanding problems add on, like difficulties in fractions, or the decimal place value system is not correctly understood. And that's another case study. It's a female, 19 years, and in this table you have the thousands, the hundreds, the tens, and the units. And maybe let's just look at the lowest example. Here is written 2000, so she entered 2, 100, a 1 at the hundreds, 35 tens, she entered it here, and 4 units, and then she just added all the numbers and thought that this would be the result, which is obviously not correct. So that's just another example, that they have problems with this place value system. Then word problems are decoded incorrectly. And this is an example of an equation that is also part of a test battery. And maybe I haven't mentioned, next to my research, I work also clinically, and I'm responsible for dyscalculia assessments for adolescents for the canton of Zurich. So I see regularly these patients as well. And this is an example of a task I use in one of the test batteries. And I don't know why, but I can say all of the dyscalculic adolescents or adults, they have no idea how to solve such an equation. Although there are many different options here that would be correct. And a typical thing is as well that they really don't see how they can simplify a calculation problem. Instead, they use very inefficient and time-consuming solution strategies. For instance, they just calculate everything in a written manner. And this is also shown in this example. I'd like you to focus on this multiplication, 199 plus 198. And you could just simplify it by calculating 200 plus 200 minus 3, for instance. And people with dyscalculia, they don't see that. They don't have the feeling to do these kind of simplifications. Instead, you see she calculated it here in a written manner, and the result was correct at the end. And the same is here, 701 minus 698. That's a very typical task as well. The dyscalculics, they don't see that these numbers are so close together. They don't have the feeling. The only thing they see is, oh, 2 big numbers I have to subtract. That's difficult. That's the thing I can't. So I learned to do it in a written way, and she did it as well, and the result was 3, was correct as well. Sometimes when they have the solution, they realize, oh, I could have seen it before, but they just don't see it. And of course, with time, the psychological pressure is growing on these children and adolescents due to constant experience of failure. In one of our studies, we were interested in the fact whether we can predict if a child in kindergarten, or which child, when you look at this image here, will develop dyscalculia. And I mean, imagine being a kindergarten teacher. I think it would be quite helpful if you could predict it. And so we included in this study around 1,600 kindergarten children and followed them until the 2nd grade. And the results have shown that it's really the specific numerical and quantity understanding in kindergarten that is the best predictor for later arithmetic performance in school. So you don't have to look at these cognitive general abilities, it's really the math part that predicts it best. And the results have shown that the weak children in kindergarten are still among the weak ones in school, so they improve, but they don't catch up. And I think it was really clear that these numerical difficulties are already apparent early on and could be addressed to really identify children that have a problem. And particularly these children that are maybe at risk to develop dyscalculia, they are dependent on support from early on. As we know from other studies as well, it's the best to start an intervention the earlier the better, because then the further developmental prospects are just more beneficial for the individual child. So what we did as well, we tried to do like a prevention study where we asked the question, is it possible to prevent this negative development of these children that might be at risk for developing dyscalculia? So we had a bunch of children in kindergarten that were all at risk, so they belonged to the lowest 10% of the math performers or numerical performers in kindergarten. And we followed them up to the 3rd grade. And with half of them, we did like a prevention program, we called it in kindergarten. And what we saw is that up to the 3rd grade, all of these children really improved in their numerical skills. And on the other hand, there were less diagnoses in these groups, in this group that did the prevention in kindergarten. In comparison to children that were also at risk in kindergarten but did not get this prevention program. So I tried to illustrate it particularly in this manner, that it was a very simply intervention we have chosen that is very practical, not under very scientific conditions, because it doesn't help anyone if it's just working under super controlled scientific conditions, but not in daily practice in kindergarten. So that's why we have chosen this approach, and the results I think are very promising and should really motivate all kindergarten teachers to look at the development of the kids and to provide the adequate support they should get. And another issue is that it's quite difficult to identify which child has now problems, which child should get an extra intervention or support. That's why we have also developed a screener for kindergarten children that can be administered in very short time, approximately 10 minutes per child, and also in a group it can be done, and it includes different kind of tasks, and I'm very happy that the publication where we evaluated this screener just was published maybe 2 weeks ago. So there is or are tools out there to really early identify children, and there are also ways to support the development of numerical cognition in children that might struggle with numbers. With this introduction into dyscalculia, I want to jump into the brain and start with first giving you a quick overview how our brain is processing numbers. I'm part of the Center of Magnetic Resonance Imaging, so we use this technique to image the brains of children. And first of all, you have to consider that a child's brain is not an adult brain, because it's in between development, fast development. And this implies, on the one hand, it's quite challenging to recruit children to participate in our studies. On the other hand, we have to develop adapted tasks to the age of the child cohort we are interested to examine. Then a major issue for MRI is motion artifacts, and kids like to move, and this is quite a challenge for our studies as well. And also in data analysis respects, we often can't just use the available pipelines that are out there for adult data. We have to adapt it to our children cohort. Just to keep it in mind that it's kind of a special challenge to work with children, but I think we have proven that it's possible and gained some interesting insights. How does the network look like for numerical cognition? I think you asked it before at Ian's talk at the end. Indeed, it is a network. It's not just one region. It's an entire network spread over the whole cortex. I won't go much into detail, but all these regions you see here are kind of part of this network, need for numerical cognition and numerical understanding. As an introduction to how our brain is calculating, I want to make a little experiment with you. And I'm going to show you some pictures of penguins, and I ask you just to shout how many penguins you saw on the picture. Ready?
2, 3, 1, 4.
Perfect. So good. No problem so far. We just continue with the same game.
7, 8, 5, 6.
Okay, already a bit more difficult, isn't it? But can you tell me, were there more penguins in the first or the second image I have shown you?
First.
Ah, very good, very good. Why is it the case? It's related to how our brain is processing numbers. On the one hand, we have these small numbers like 2, 3, 4, 5 penguins maybe, we just can perceive the numerosity without counting. It's called subitizing. And on the other hand, we have this approximate feeling of magnitudes. We can't exactly tell 7, 8, 6 penguins maybe, but we definitely saw, the first one had more than the second one. And coming back, and this is related to the fact that we have these different systems in our brain. We have this non-symbolic, we call it, representation for concrete magnitudes. And if they are small, we can perceive it by subitizing. We don't have to count it. And if it's more, this approximate system comes into play. And we know that we don't need a language system for that. It's language independent. And on the other hand, we have symbolic processing with Arabic digits. And there, this enables us to calculate exactly, for instance. It's language dependent. We need words for these symbols as well. And it's part of the system that we learn to build up numerical facts that we can retrieve from memory. And just an interesting side note, in the Amazon, there's a tribe. They're called Piraha. And they have let's say, a limited language for numbers. They just have words for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And everything that's more than 5, they just call it many. And they did a lot of different experiments with them beyond 5. And what they found is that tasks that just depend on this non-symbolic, language-independent, approximate system, they were equally well able to solve these tasks like we do. However, the ones that are language-dependent and need words for these numbers, of course, they failed. Coming back to the system of our brain, we have these green areas here for the identification of digits or magnitudes, visually or auditorily, for instance. And the key region in our brain for numerosity is located up here in the parietal lobe. And it's supposed to be our number sense. It's the location where this approximate system is encoded. It enables us to compare like dot clouds or estimate different sizes. And it's also assumed that it's kind of spatially represented there. So it's like a mental number line where we can move back and forth and have a feeling where the size of these numbers are. The subitizing, so this very quick enumeration of small quantities, happens already a bit lower, let's say already in visual areas, this numeric decoding. And as I told you, we have also this language-dependent fact retrieval strategy to solve equations, calculation problems. And this is mainly located in areas on the left hemisphere, in this yellow branch here, that enables us to retrieve numerical facts from long-term memory. And I have brought you another case study. This time it's a female, 17 years, and she had to solve this multiplication and divisions, as you see it on the slide, and all perfect, all correct, no problem at all. With the same young woman, I made some counting tasks. For instance, in the first one, she had to count forward from 185 in steps of 2. She failed. In the second one, she had to count in steps of 10 backwards. She failed. The last one, count forward in steps of 100. She failed. Simple subtractions, she just was able to solve it by the help of her fingers. And like this equation here, for instance, is subtraction, she just solved it also in a written way. How can it be that this female is perfectly able to solve these quite complex multiplication and divisions, but fails on these simple tasks? And this is where neuroscience can give us some answers. Coming back to this model here, as I've shown you before, the brain has different routes to process numbers. And she was perfectly fine with the yellow one. This is things she could learn by heart and retrieve. However, the other tasks, they were more relying on really numerical understanding, on this key area of numerosity, and there she showed problems and struggled. We have also motor regions included for finger representation, finger counting, and of course a lot of areas in the frontal lobe for supporting functions like working memory and regulation of salience and attention. So this is how the network looks like, and this has to develop, of course. And these are really just the very brief developmental steps. The first thing that is, in my point of view, very interesting, and maybe not all of you know, is that when we are born, we already have kind of a approximate number sense. So there are experiments with newborn babies that have shown that they can discriminate between different magnitudes. So there seems to be kind of an inborn capacity to discriminate between magnitudes. This becomes more complex the more we experience I lost the word. The more experience we gain with larger quantities, the better we get in that as well. And one thing what we learn is that we kind of combine these magnitudes also with spatial characteristics, usually that smaller quantities use smaller space, 10 apples need bigger space, and we consider these spatial aspects as well in our numerical decisions, and we develop a kind of a mental number line like this spatial representation of numbers. Kids learn to count first just number words. It's just number words without any meaning. Then they learn the one-to-one principle, that every single thing I count, I just have to count it once. And at the end, they learn the cardinality principle, that the last number I have counted, this corresponds to the amount, like the cardinal system. Kindergarten or school, they learn other coding, the Arabic digits, so now they have to combine like these concrete magnitudes with the number word and the Arabic digit, and they also learn that Arabic digits can have an ordinal meaning like first, second, third, and so on. and they learn simple calculations, first just by counting. 2 plus 3 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And later on, which is more efficient, they learn to retrieve these simple facts by memory. What is going on in the brain? We did some experiments, longitudinal ones, with children with and without dyscalculia to see how this network develops. So on the top row, you have the typically developing children, and below the dyscalculic children. And we look from above on the brain, and these yellow clusters are activation. And you have to trust me, this is a typical activation pattern that we see in numerosity. And during development, we see that calculation processes get automated. And with this, we see like a focusing on the key regions in the backside. And these regions here, what you see also here, are the key areas for number processing. It's called the intraparietal sulcus. And moreover, when kids learn to use Arabic digits, it seems that there's like a shift more to the left-hand side. Our left hemisphere is important for language processing, and Arabic digits is like learning a new language for numeracy. And in general, we see a focusing on core areas for number processing over development. How does it look in children with dyscalculia? What we have observed here is a significant increase in brain activation in the entire network. And these regions you see here, these are the right regions. That's the number network, I can tell you. However, when I look at this image here, it resembles me rather from an image from a younger child. So this focusing seems not to have taken place yet, or maybe it does never happen, we don't know. But it just points kind of a developmental delay, how the neuronal activation network looks like in adolescents with dyscalculia. With magnetic resonance imaging, we can look at brain function. And how does it look in dyscalculics? Simplified back to this model, generally literature showed that in these key regions, dyscalculics show reduced activation, whereas in the frontal parts, they show increased activation. It reflects kind of a compensatory mechanism, so they need more effort, more attentional resources to solve simple tasks. And I have just brought you one example that you see a brain as well. And the main activation for controlled children is seen in the key regions here, in the intraparietal sulcus, where the main activation for the dyscalculic group is seen in the medial frontal lobe of our brain. With MRI, we have the possibility to have high-resolution anatomical images as well. So we also looked at anatomical images of children with and without dyscalculia. And also there, we saw clear differences. We saw reduced gray matter volume. Gray matter is the part of the brain where the neurons are located. And on the one hand, we saw reduced gray matter here in the intraparietal sulcus, which you now know is kind of the neuronal correlate of numerical understanding or our number sense. But we also saw reduced gray matter in other parts of the brain. On the right-hand side here, we are a bit more to the frontal part of the brain. You can already see here the eyes cut. And yeah, also here we have seen some reduced gray matter. And this corresponds rather to maybe related difficulties as well in working memory, attention, or other executive functions. As you have heard in Ian's talk, and I just touched it briefly before as well, particularly people with dyscalculia develop often math anxiety. And this is a case study of a young woman. She's 19 years old, and she was in gymnasium, so highly intelligent, and was able, or well able, to describe her situation. And this is what she wrote me, and I just will quickly read it for you. after my math and physics grades didn't improve despite regular intensive tutoring sessions, 4 per week, and on the contrary, I started the next school year with very bad grades, I was incredibly worried. I was at loss and desperate because despite all the studying, hard work, and the effort involved, I couldn't get any better grades. Once again, I fundamentally doubted and disapproved of myself and questioned my own abilities. All of this took a toll on me, made me incredibly sad and tired, and increasingly weakened and wore me down. I have to say that this person, she really developed also a burnout. She had to leave school and had to be medicated to improve her mental state as well. But because it's so prevalent in dyscalculics, math anxiety, I was interested whether math anxiety is also seen in the brain. And in the brain, we have the region amygdala, which is kind of the key region for stress and anxiety regulation. And I looked at the relation between the extent of math anxiety and structural changes in the brain. And what I saw is that particularly, or just uniquely in the amygdala, we saw a relation. Here you have the level of math anxiety. 10 is a lot of math anxiety, 0 no math anxiety, and that's the volume of the amygdala. And we saw that the more the people suffer from math anxiety, the smaller was the size of the amygdala. So coming for a last time back to the model, here the ghost, like the anxiety part, so also emotions seem to play a particular role in numeracy and numerical cognition. We can also look at fiber connections, like our brain is highly interconnected, and we were interested if there are differences as well. And what the findings have shown is that the key region from the number sense to other regions is worse in people or children with dyscalculia, and also the connections between memory areas and numerical areas, they were less well developed. So it seems also to be a problem in numerical or in the connection between these regions. And we were even able to predict, depending on the establishment of these fibers, how they're going to perform 4 years later. To the last point, our brain is highly plastic, and as I told you, I was interested also in translating our findings into daily practice, and we developed an intervention for children with dyscalculia. It was a computerized training, and I looked at neuronal changes, and we saw that the brain adapts when you train it accordingly, and we saw that there was an increase in brain activation in these red areas here. That's the intraparietal sulcus, you're now experts too, key regions, and a reduction in frontal areas after the training. So I have shown you a lot of different images of the brain, that it looks different, there are activation differences, connection differences, and so on. But there is a question of causality, the chicken or egg. Is it just a result of the struggles they have we see in these images, or are these neuronal impairments present before and lead to the problems in numeracy? And PhD study student of mine, she did a morphometry analysis, which means she looked at the morphometry of the brain and particularly of the shape of the intraparietal sulcus, this key area for numeracy. And first, this is indicated in blue, she realized that it has different types, and in dyscalculics we mainly saw this type. We called it double horizontal, but doesn't matter. And what does it tell us about the causality? Because I have to tell you that the way these sulci are shaped depends already before we are born in utero, and after that stays very stable over development. So it seems that like if you are born with this type of intraparietal sulcus, it might be a potential risk factor to develop dyscalculia. And as I'm running out of time, I will shorten it and maybe stop after this slide. And what is the situation out there is that usually affected children, they don't get the support they need. And this leads to avoidance. So they avoid everything with math. A lot of self-doubts. It comes to conflicts at schools, conflict with parents, a lot of arguments. Some tend to behave aggressively. Some are really sad, a lot of tears, a lot of crying, social withdrawal. More females develop depressive symptoms, for instance, as well. And we just recently published another article where we could show that particularly in children with dyscalculia, the amount is higher that develop some of these depressive symptoms compared to other learning disorders like dyslexia or ADHD. There it's less frequent. Comes to school refusal, feelings of helplessness, resignation, and up to suicide. And my take-home message for you is please don't wait until these kids really fail, because I hope I could show you we could help them when we detect them early and provide them the adequate support. And the next slides I will skip and come to my take-home message. And I hope you know now that dyscalculia is a persisting learning disorder that could be detected early. And the dyscalculic brain functions differently. I've shown you a lot of evidence for that, but it's highly plastic. And when you look at, when it comes to diagnostics, look how the children are calculating, not just at the results, because as I've shown you, if you just look at the results, they might be correct. So it doesn't tell you anything about dyscalculia. And finally, adequate support can really prevent failure for these children. With this, I'd like to thank all of you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Karin, for an excellent overview of dyscalculia, both from brain and behavior. So we have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you for an interesting talk. I was wondering, you're here describing like the two qualitatively different groups, like dyscalculia and normal controls. And I was wondering if we look at these results with the nerve fibers and activation patterns and so forth, and look at it on the full continuum, like from extremely good at math to extreme problems, do you see kind of a linear relation, or is there like a clear categorical boundary in those kind of activation patterns, or do you see that the extremely good at math have super many nerve fibers and etc.?
Yeah. No.
So it kind of relates to the whole talk in that sense.
Yeah, no, thank you for this nice question, because it's a completely artificial and arbitrary gap where you say, if a child has, I don't know, 16 points, it is dyscalculic. If it has 17, it's not dyscalculic. That makes no sense. And it is a continuum, of course. You have these kids that struggle really a lot with math and are typically, but you have the ones that are on the border. These are the ones that are difficult to diagnose. And I think it's not important if you give a diagnosis or not. The important thing is that you identify children that have problems with math and provide them the support they need. You don't need a diagnosis for that, I think. Just look at the child and provide them the best possibilities to develop their numerical cognition. And the same is in the brain. I mean, it's not a sharp edge between white and black, for instance. It's a continuum, and we also have these continuous approaches in analyzing our data as well. And
does it extend also into the, like the non-dyscalculics? Like, do you see the same kind of linear pattern up to the ones who are math whizzes?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gives differences if you talk about these super math brainers, let's call them, because what studies have shown is that they use kind of different strategies to solve it. They retrieve much more from long-term memory, for instance, and they show higher activations than in these areas. So it's not continuum, it's also a change of strategy. And this is what you also see, like if you have a poor performer that uses just counting strategies, it's related to other regions than the one that is retrieving more from memory, for instance. There are more questions.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. How early would you say that we could reliably detect and diagnose dyscalculia?
Yeah, that's a good question. The reliability increases the older the children are, of course. And there is a study that have shown that like in the first grade, the reliability is not that good, but from the second grade on, it's getting much, much more reliable. So the diagnosis is much more stable, I would say, because the younger the children are, the wider the variance between individuals is how they are developed in numerical cognition. It depends on how they are supported from their parents, how they were stimulated and so on. Some are already quite good when they come to kindergarten, others can't even count. So that's why I think this gap has to close a bit during development and schooling, and the diagnosis, I would say, is kind of stable from the second grade on. But in general, diagnosis is mostly done from the third, fourth grade on.
Yeah, in Sweden from fourth grade normally here, yes.
But in Switzerland, sometimes I hear from parents that the children were not diagnosed because the school said, we don't make any diagnostics before, let's say, the 5th grade. Oh. And I would say that's wrong as well, because it would be possible to identify these children before, and it's very important time that is just lost where you could support these children.
Thank you very much.
I guess it kind of like aligns with this question. That was one of my questions too, but I wanted to add with what could we do as a parent? Because I've got a little kid. She's 1.5 years old, and I don't really like math that much. Mm-hmm. So I saw some of your case studies, and sometimes you're like, what? So I'm not gonna self-diagnose, but I don't know. I might have a little bit of dyscalculia, but because of that, and I'm a single parent. She starts school now, but I've already like stimulated her into like at least knowing the numbers because she's at that age. What could we do to, as a parent, to, I guess, like prevent it going to have like a full-on for her to have a full-on dyscalculia at a younger age?
Yeah. First of all, I have to start with kind of a negative answer, because there are studies out there that have shown that if a parent, particularly females, are math anxious or have a negative attitude towards math, it transfers to the children. The same has been shown with teachers, particularly female teachers that are math anxious. It transfers to the students they have, mainly to the female, to the girls, that they tend to develop also like math anxiety or just negative attitudes toward math. That's the negative thing. But the positive thing I could give you is like, stimulate your child. Just try to include numbers in daily living. Just, point to numbers, count things, bake a cake together and measure things. And I mean, math is not just arithmetic, let's say. It's experiencing like weight or length or all these kind of things. And the more I think you include it in your daily life, the more familiar he or she will get with numbers and feel more comfortable with it. And don't try to transfer your maybe negative feelings by saying things like, oh, I was also never good at math. Oh, girls don't have to be good at math.
Oh, right.
Just don't tell these things.
Yeah. I would never say that.
Yeah, but it's still in the minds of the of the society. We have just done a questionnaire with 3rd graders, girls and boys, and we asked whether they're equal good and so on, and they were equal good. Girls and boys are equally well in math, and what they think if one is prior to the other, and it's still they answered. The girl thought that, and the boy thought that the boys are better, and it was particularly driven by the boys' answers, that they tend to think that girls are less well in math, but it's a societal problem.
I have another question. Sorry. The way that you mentioned, like girls and boys are different. We know that there's a trend kind of recently with like girl math and boy math. So like girl math usually like I'll take an hour to get ready and then drive for 5 minutes. So like that's the girl math, and it's usually girls who does that, and that develops into adulthood. And people are kind of like making it people are kind of normalizing it. You as a neuroscientist and who works with these type of things, how would you react to that? Like how would you, like this is a serious issue. Dyscalculia is a serious issue, and people out there like not like making fun of it, like normalizing it. What would you do as a neuroscientist to kind of like tackle with that?
I mean, I would say, of course, dyscalculia is a serious issue, and it affects a bit more girls than boys. Yeah. But like coming to this gender issue, it's a big question how we can overcome this, and there are definitely cultural differences. Like in other countries, or I don't know, computer science is a typical female domain, for instance, whereas here it's more a male domain, and I think it's really up to us. To the teachers, to the parents, to the society to overcome this image, because it's definitely not the case that there is any genetical predisposition while females should be worse at math than male, for instance. There might be a tendency of interests that differ, but still you have highly qualified mathematicians that are female.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
That might be good role models as well.
Okay, one final question.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk. I was thinking about inattention, because you also mentioned the comorbidity and so on. And I was thinking of some of the examples you showed that this is typical of dyscalculia. How would you say that inattention could affect some of these? For example, I was thinking about the counting backwards, or making those, not seeing that the numbers are close and so on.
Yeah. First of all, it's very common that children with dyscalculia have attentional problems, and this is a difficulty in the diagnostics as well. And that's why we always include like attentional tests in our diagnostics, because sometimes we have a child with attentional issues that show quite similar problems as a dyscalculic, but the core issue is not that they don't understand the numbers, it's more that they can't attend to or focus on the task they have to do. And it's hard sometimes to disentangle, because it's often a combination of both, whether the major issue is now the attentional problem, or is it really the problem on understanding numbers or numerosities. And that's why you have to be very careful in diagnostics, and you need some experience, because like a child that is more inattentive show different mistakes or different strategies how they solve number problems than a child with dyscalculia. And by this you really can tell, is it rather because it's inattentive or because it's dyscalculic.
Can you give some examples of that? How you could differentiate?
Yeah, for instance, like I have shown you some case studies that they don't see that like these 701 minus 698, that these numbers are so close. They don't see it, the dyscalculics. But this is not a problem for a child with ADHD. They can see that. They have the problem to focus on. So it would be mainly the strategy, how they solve it. For instance, always in a written manner, because they don't have feeling for the numbers and so on, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
I think we unfortunately
you
are
can
out
ask
of,
later. I'm
yeah,
here.
unfortunately out of time. We could spend a lot of time talking about dyscalculia, but for now we're moving on to maybe our highlight of today, which is our last speaker, Mikael Skagenholt. But before he's giving his speech or talk, we also have an award to give him. So for this reason, I'm calling down Jonas as the chair.
Thank you, Kenny. Yes, this is the main event of this evening. So it's a great honor to be able to present the awards, the award to a young researcher in psychology for the year of 2023. And as you already know, it's Mikael Skagenholt of Linköping University. So I would like you to come up here and bask a little bit in the glory for now, while I tell you a little bit about this award. So basically every year, the departments of psychology in Sweden get to nominate up to 2 candidates, particularly promising new PhDs of different genders. So we have about 20 or so every year are nominated for this award. So the competition is very fierce. The competition is tough. And we have a very qualified awards committee that's every year gets to read the dissertations and read the research papers of each of the nominees and eventually select a winner. And the awards committee for the 2023 award was Daniel Westfjell, Linda Hassing, Andreas Olsson, Katja Boersma och Per-Anders Granhag. So a set of really qualified experts who evaluated many different types of research. And we have a motivation which is in Swedish. So I will, if you let me, I'll read from the switch to Swedish, and I hope that most of you will understand. Så Dr. Mikael Skagenholt ställer grundläggande frågor om människans förmåga att representera numeriska värden. I sin avhandling Neurocognitive Foundations of Child and Adult Number Processing undersöker han med stor teoretisk bredd och imponerande metodologisk skärpa olika kognitiva modeller för nummerrepresentation. Skagenholt visar även prov på framgångsrikt vetenskapligt arbete vid sidan om sitt forskningsfokus och har efter disputationen fortsatt med sin etablering av en självständig forskningslinje. Sammantaget bedöms Mikael Skagenholt vara en mycket värdig pristagare för Nationalkommitténs pris till yngre forskare i psykologi 2023. So a brief summary in English would be something about that his research on cognitive models of number representations demonstrates a great theoretical range and an impressive methodological precision. And he has also shown independence besides his PhD work to establish his own line of research. And this is very important for young researchers. So with that being said, I am very proud to hand over this diploma to you, and we'll arrange with the monetary award as well, but at a later occasion. So here's the award.
Yes. Thank you so much.
And now I leave the floor to you.
Yes, and I think what will be proper now is to do a sort of a thank you or acknowledgement speech, but I'm going to save that until the end of my presentation because I don't have enough mental flexibility at this specific moment to sort of jump in advance that much. So bear with me while I first give you a brief overview of my research interests. So, my presentation is called Neurocognitive Foundations of Child and Adult Number Processing. And this corresponds directly to the title of my thesis. My intention with this talk is to sort of zoom out a bit now. So we've gone into a lot of specifics regarding numerical cognition and the sort of neuroscientific basis or methods we could use to understand numerical cognition. And I'm going to try now to zoom out a bit and talk partly why I find this topic so interesting, and hopefully I can convince some of you to find it at least a bit interesting, or to some degree as interesting as myself, or even more so, which would be ideal, really. And so I will discuss basically why I think this is interesting, and specifically also why I think that neuroscientific methods can add value. Not necessarily replace the idea of behavioral science or behavioral studies, which are crucial, but as a sort of supplement, in a supplementary fashion, how we can expand our knowledge even more by using neuroscientific methods. So there are a few sort of key questions that I find specifically interesting here. First of all, I think most of us can agree, at least to some extent, that math is hard. There's something special about math that makes it harder, or at least to many of us, harder than other academic subjects. But why is that the case, really? What is it that is special about math that makes it such a huge focus in terms of academic anxiety and constitutes such a large part of our sort of academic success or choices of careers and vocations, and even might sort of constitute the main driver of what type of subject we tend to study at university, for instance, where we either try to go into something that features a lot of math, which might be hard, but we might, on the other hand, enjoy it a lot, or we might avoid math as much as possible and go into sort of other type of vocational or academic tracks that feature as little math as possible. And this also relates directly to the second point here. So what is it that distinguishes math from other academic subjects? And to go a bit in advance here, I think one sort of fruitful way to look at math is the fact that it follows a sort of hierarchy or a specific type of progression that you might not find in something like language, for instance. Language is much more of a, in my opinion at least, a more linearly developing system. We learn to speak pretty early on in development, and we sort of acquire new words or new sort of grammatical concepts in a pretty straightforward linear fashion. It builds upon the other. Whereas in math, it's more of a sort of discontinuous process. In order to be able to at all sort of distinguish or assign words to specific quantities, we must first sort of acquire the ability or be able to use the sort of evolutionarily inherited ability to distinguish different quantities to begin with. So that provides a foundation for the development of what we can call a core number system. In turn, we then ascend this sort of staircase yet another step, where we learn to recognize that number symbols actually carry some sort of meaning that correspond to values or to quantities that we can actually perceive in our environment. So we learn somehow then to map a specific symbolic representation to a specific number of objects, such as my 2 fingers that I see here, and also start developing sort of the sense that these symbols are somehow related to one another. They form part of a counting sequence. They have a sequential positional value. They sort of have interrelationships between each other in order to figure out concepts such as selecting the second seat in a row, for instance, out of, say, 3 seats. But then we sort of go up even further in abstraction here. So we start to apply these very basic sort of means of pointing out how symbols relate to specific quantities in our environment. And we start developing complex symbolic systems with given rules and with specific relationships that we need to be able to track and understand how adding two objects turns into sort of a symbol that represents this additive process, right? And as we've seen then, this in previous talks, this becomes yet more complex. Sort of the more we develop and the longer we sort of stay in school, we start experiencing rational and even at some mathematical levels irrational numbers. And this also, at the end, sort of feeds into the idea of financial abilities, or what we could more broadly call numeracy. So being able to understand numerical information on the one hand, but also then act on that information and use it as a basis for our decision-making processes. So a key feature of what interests me in this sort of research field is how can we understand numerical and mathematical cognition? So primarily what we would maybe associate with the higher sort of levels of this staircase here. How can we understand that in terms of the lower level mechanisms? So how are basic perceptual abilities, for instance, how did those come into play? But also things like, as we mentioned before, working memory and other types of very basic cognitive mechanisms. How did those contribute and create this sort of conditions for us to ascend this staircase over developmental time? In other words, we can look at this more graphically. How do we go from this, that is, for instance, as Karin mentioned, subitizing, being able to quickly and effortlessly see that we have 3 apples to the left side of the screen, to that is complex numerical representations and manipulation of numerical information in line with certain sets of rules that we need to follow to arrive at a specific conclusion. So one sort of key idea for the use of neuroscience here is to try to understand not only how does the brain represent these basic processes, but also use it as a tool to try to differentiate what is it the brain does differently, if anything, going from this to that. So at its core, I think this is a question of the sort of nature versus nurture debate, right? So as we've seen, we share the ability to estimate quantities or act on numerical information with a lot of different non-human species. So it seems to be the case that at least on a purely behavioral level, we seem to resemble non-human animals. There's some type of commonality in our evolutionary history that contributes to the ability to act on numerical information, right? So to what extent is this a product of just evolutionary or a product of evolution versus a product of cultural pressures? So we know for a fact that humans are the only species that we know of so far that actually apply numerical information in terms of verbal and symbolic systems. We can transform these very basic representations of, you know, how many penguins you see, for instance, or how many apples you see, to a formalized system. So there's some sort of interesting interaction going on here between both the evolutionarily hardwired abilities for basic object perception, just the ability essentially to be able to tell that there are 3 apples over here or 5 apples over here, for instance, and how that could then guide behavior in a more or less rational way. For instance, selecting more numerous sources of food over less numerous sources of food. Although I recently learned that this might not even be that evolutionarily hardwired, because Kenny told me that his dog completely ignores this sort of principle and just goes for the closest source of food, and not the most numerous sort of amount of food. So there might be an effect of culture there that we've sort of undervalued a bit. So the idea here is that what motivates me in studying numerical cognition from a neuroscientific perspective is to try to understand to what extent is numerical cognition then dependent on these basic evolutionary processes, and to what extent does culture play a role in shape these and sort of transform these basic evolutionary processes. You could say, in other words, what do we know sort of inherently and what remains to be learned? So there have been a few examples mentioned so far from the literature, but I want to highlight sort of two key examples that I think are really fascinating sort of examples of numerical cognition. So on the left here, you see a chicken who, with pretty minimal training, is able to identify which of these collections, or arrays as we call them, of dots is more numerous. So with very little incentive and with very little training, this chicken obviously has some sort of basic perceptual capacity to select the right-hand side here. And we can see a similar sort of mechanism taking place also in as young as 5-month-old infants. So a very sort of famous study from 1992 by Karen Wynn shows that in a similar sense that the chicken sort of intuitively knows, or can approximate at least, that one alternative is more than the other, more numerous than the other. Pre-verbal children also have a sort of expectation on numerical quantity. So if you do an experiment where you first present an object to a child in a sort of makeshift stage almost, raise a screen to hide this object, place a second object behind this raised screen, and then clearly indicate to the child that your hand leaves empty, so you're not bringing any objects out with you. What can then happen is that if once you sort of lower the screen and you show 2 remaining toys in this box or on this sort of makeshift stage, children are generally not at all surprised and show no sort of signs of interest if 2 objects remain. Whereas if just 1 object remains, so say you have some sort of hidden trap door in this sort of box so that you can remove one of the objects out of sight of the child. So 1 toy remains where 2 should have been initially. Children are very sort of shocked. They look at this for a long time, and you can tell that their expectation of this entire situation has been what's the word? Sorry. Violated. So they have already at 5 months of age, without any type of verbal sort of knowledge about mathematics and basic arithmetic, they have an expectancy that basic addition should entail that if you have 1 object and add 1 more, you should have 2 objects. And if that sort of intuition is violated, they are very sort of concerned, and they don't really understand what is going on in the situation. So chickens and human infants seem to have basic sort of notions or ideas about what constitutes numerical quantity and how they relate to one another. We can also see very compelling similarities between humans and non-human primates, primarily in research, at both the behavioral and the neural levels. So in administering the type of task that Karin just showed you, for instance, in trying to discriminate if there are more penguins on one side of the screen versus on the other side of the screen, we can see that On the behavioral level, performance drops quite drastically in humans, primarily as a function of how many objects there are to be compared, but also how closely sort of the quantities to be compared overlap with one another. So we see the same type of behavioral pattern also in non-human primates, so monkeys. And even more so, we can see that the neural activation of the IPS, of which you are all now experts since the last talk, is actually remarkably similar for both humans and non-human primates in a sort of functionally equivalent parietal region. So this would further sort of reinforce the idea that there is a strong evolutionary component to basic number processing, and that it might, to some extent, also constitute a very specific cognitive skill that has evolved over time as a result of a very specific need that needs to be met. For instance, something alike our ability to recognize faces and prioritize sort of, the recognition of faces over other types of visual objects, which we can see both in monkeys, where we can very clearly sort of isolate the neural activity elicited by faces from other types of visual stimuli, and we can see that in humans as well. So there is a strong case to be made that basic number processing is also sort of one of these core cognitive abilities that we're all born with. But then the question is sort of, is numerosity special? Is the ability to recognize numerical quantity and manipulate this information, is there anything special about that? Do we somehow evolve to favor number over other types of continuous magnitudes? And this can include things like size, for instance, or duration of time, or intensity of a stimulus, luminance, and so on. And if that is the case, are there then sort of shared neurocognitive mechanisms between the perception of something like size and number, or are these completely distinct things? A very famous sort of model or approach in numerical cognition holds that quantity is only part sort of a grander system here, of a system of generalized magnitude, which also includes things that are sort of inseparable parts of everyday experience. So beyond quantity, we also have things like space, so spatial awareness and spatial sort of recognition, that different objects have different sizes and are sort of located at different spatial scales from ourselves, and also the concept of time. So how long does it actually take to perform a certain task, for instance? And a very practical example of that would be if I were to raise this sort of glass here. We have an interaction between number and space and time, in the sense that I need to recognize that it's one specific object I'm trying to pick up, and I need to also sort of have an understanding of how far away is this singular object from me, and how much time would it take me to pick this object up and get it to my desired state, right? So basically what quantity and then space and time would allow us to do is to use this as a representation for all of our sort of motor interactions with our environment. So all of these parts contribute to being able to appropriately interact with objects in our environment, basically. And there are quite mixed findings. This is far from a sort of settled matter if number is special in any sense, or if it's part of a larger system. We have, for instance, habituation studies investigating how young children sort of react and respond to basic tasks, where they cannot give us verbal indications of what they're thinking at the moment, or give us any type of sort of verbal report of how they're trying to solve a problem. where we instead try to look at how interested does a child seem to be in this specific task or a specific outcome, for instance. So this type of habituation research has been used to show, for instance, that if you habituate a child to something of a greater size, so say that you show a large green square repeatedly, and you show a sort of a smaller orange square, for instance, repeatedly, you habituate a specific shape and a specific color to a specific dimensions, such as size in this case. And what you can see there is that if you switch then to collections of dots, for instance, to represent numerosity, children tend to then expect that features that share the same color and shape would, if they were presented as large, they also expect to see more numerous objects, so a larger quantity of objects that share those same characteristics. So that would indicate that there's a very strong link between space and time. On the other hand, we have pretty recent research actually, which used a novel approach to try to see if the separation of quantity from other types of cues is something that is mostly mediated by attention. Here, children, newborn children, so just a couple of hours old really, were exposed to both visual stimuli and auditory stimuli, both when they were awake and also when they were asleep. And you can see distinct neural responses to a specific quantity of objects, be it visual squares or auditory tones, both during the sort of awake part, which would align with the fact that we maybe select out numerosity as something more interesting to focus on, but also during sleep. So in a sort of pre-attentive stage where children are not even aware that there's some sort of numerical task going on around them, the brain still responds to the number of objects, visual objects or auditory tones in a sequence, for instance, in the same way as during the sort of awake period. So this would suggest, on the other hand, that there is in fact something very special about number, and that we don't necessarily need to sort of disentangle number from anything else. So far I've spoken mostly about the sort of evolutionarily older abilities of quantity processing, but how about cultural developments? So there's no reasonable way that the brain can have evolved to handle symbolic numerical representations. We haven't really evolved the capacity for math or for representing two objects as the digit 2. So there's something else going on here. In other words, you could say that the cultural invention of symbolic number representations is too novel on a sort of evolutionary timescale to be a product entirely of sort of the evolutionary effects on the brain. So one compelling argument here is that the way in which we construct these cultural systems to begin with is very much a product of the brain, in the sense that the brain affords us certain limitations. It's sort of the bounding box in which all culture can evolve, given our limited abilities for perception, for instance. We can only perceive certain colors or certain auditory tones and so on. But also then that all cultural expressions are a product of these limitations and also influence the development of each individual brain by essentially, you could say, hijacking old mechanisms for new purposes. And then the question becomes, okay, but how does this process happen? How do we use evolutionarily quite old cognitive and perceptual mechanisms to develop new cultural expressions? And how do these cultural expressions in turn, such as the count list or basic arithmetic, shape this sort of evolution of the brain going forward? And all of this to say that these considerations were ultimately then what laid the foundation for my thesis work, where I wanted to increase our understanding of how the neurotypical child and adult brain perceives and processes numerical information. So essentially, say that you're faced with a situation where you're at a grocery store. I know I will have to update this example at some point because we're going more into a cashless society. But for now, bear with me, and I hope you have some memories of what coins are like, bills are like, for instance. But say that you're at a cash register and the number 3 comes up. How do we then go from this symbolic representation of 3? How do we, in a sense, translate or convert, as I think Ian Lyons talked about it, this representation into both these sort of verbal label of 3, and how does that correspond to or map with the 3 coins that we then produce from our wallets? So that is really sort of the basic level of what interests me. And to investigate that, I think it's important then to firstly understand how the brain processes these different numerical representations. So is there any overlap or difference between being faced with the digit 3, the number word 3, or 3 coins, for instance? And is this processing, sort of irrespective of format, dependent on shared or less shared neurocognitive mechanisms? Is it the same basic process that's taking place when we talk about 3 apples versus the number 3, or are these separate things entirely? And as the third point or third research question, is there any difference from childhood to adulthood in how these capacities are sort of instantiated by the brain? Is there a developmental effect here where we obviously learn to become better at math or better at dealing with numbers in general, but what is that actually due to? Is there some sort of maturation process here that we can track at the neural level? We've talked quite a bit, if nothing else implicitly, about this theoretical framework, so I'm going to just briefly go over this. But the main idea is then that this thesis was based on the idea of the triple code model. So essentially a framework for trying to understand how these different numerical representations relate to one another and how they sort of emerge as products of these evolutionarily older perceptual systems. So if we start in the left figure here from the sort of very bottom, we can see that the main idea here is that stimuli, whether they be presented sort of visually as a collection of apples, for instance, or as a sort of auditory sequence of tones, for instance, result in a specific pattern of brain activation here. This is a very sort of simplified model, but the idea would then be that perceiving 6 apples in this case produces one type of neural response, whereas perceiving 5 apples produces another closely related but still distinct neural response. This is in turn then believed to be the mechanism by which we establish the mental number line that Karin was telling us about. So sort of the representation of how different numbers relate to one another and how they sort of ascend or descend in a sequence. And also sort of the primary foundation of how we build our basic symbolic number knowledge. So we compare the cultural expressions here to the same type of activity elicited by our very basic evolutionarily old representations to build an understanding of what the digit 1, for instance, actually corresponds to. So with this as a framework, my thesis mainly then focused on trying to understand, does this hold at the neural level? Is it actually the case that the activity pattern we see when doing different types of basic numerical processing tasks does this show this overlap so in terms of a common sort of neurocognitive mechanism here? And this was mainly done in a few different steps, and you could roughly say that this follows sort of the path from a bit basic approach in identification, so trying to figure out which areas of the brain are actually involved, up to sort of the more novel approaches of things like predictive modeling, for instance. So trying to understand the brain and behavior associations, or things like functional connectivity, for instance, as we mentioned here before. So in terms of how do these regions of the brain coordinate with one another to create these complex behaviors, right? Instead of just trying to identify whether or not a specific region is activated by a task. And this resulted then in work that partially then targeted the sort of neural correlates of basic number processing, both in adults and in children, and also naturally sort of fed into the question of, do these neural correlates differ, and if so, how? It also invited questions of mechanistic differences, so going beyond the basic idea that a neural region is either turned on or turned off, versus how these individual regions act sort of in concert to produce something more complex and something more than the sort of sum of their parts. And finally then, if we can predict behavioral outcomes specifically related to numerical and mathematical abilities from the so-called functional connectome, so the entire network of brain regions that is important to number processing. Starting from the beginning, I'm not going to go too much into detail on any of these results. I'm trying to keep this at a sort of very general level as much as possible. But we then started out, and here I have to stress that this is very much collaborative work. This is not something I've done on my own. It's very much sort of a project of my supervisors as well. But what we started investigating then was whether or not these different types of number representations, such as Arabic numbers, number words, and non-symbolic representations of quantity, such as dots, do they elicit activity in the same regions across the brain? And if not, how do they differ? And one key aspect of this was that we found then, in line with many of the sort of concurrently published research papers, that numerical cognition is unlikely to be able to be reduced to just one specific system that deals with number or quantity. It's rather sort of a complex interaction between all of the different systems that Colin just showed you, which have to do with things like executive functions and working memory, visual identification, memory systems, even anxiety in terms of sort of amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex system. So we can't necessarily reduce number processing to just this sort of evolutionarily inherited basic skill. There is something else taking place there that targets or sort of involves many more different cognitive mechanisms, both those more specific to number processing, but also those more general cognitive processes, such as working memory, for instance, or visual skills and abilities, and visuospatial sort of processing abilities. So that was one of the main findings then, that we're dealing with multiple sort of neurocognitive systems here, not only those that can entirely sort of delineate to math or numbers. As a follow-up on this, we also then recruited a sample of children to try to see, okay, so are there any developmental differences here? And interestingly, when we started with the sort of identification part of this project, we found quite minor differences between children and adults at the activity level. But and also a significant overlap in the regions that both children and adults recruited for these basic number processing tasks. So essentially just deciding, is 7 more than 5? Is 7 more than 5? Or are 7 dots more than 5 dots? So very basic things, really. So this is pretty interesting because given that you had or observed such minor differences in activity, what then explains the effects of maturation on number processing? Because we know for a fact that adults tend to be better than children in sort of complex applied math. We know that adults are generally faster in sort of number processing, basic number processing tasks without losing accuracy necessarily. So there's something going on here. And then we turned to the sort of connectivity level. So the idea that, okay, how are there developmental differences in how these regions connect to and sort of talk to each other? And if so, can that help us explain the developmental differences we see in math? And we can see there that the results were largely in line with what Ian Lyons calls the symbolic estrangement effect. So essentially the idea that we might start out with a pretty strong relationship between non-symbolic representations of number and symbolic representations, where understanding how those two types of representations interact is a foundation to acquire symbolic number skills and be able to understand what a specific Arabic digit means, for instance. But that this appears to sort of, this interdependence appears to lessen over developmental time. So that number symbols really sort of form their own separate associative system. So we start to conceive of numbers, symbolic numbers, in relation to other numbers and not necessarily to non-symbolic number representations. And as a final sort of step in this process then, so say that we are correct in assuming then that a sort of distinct associative symbolic system emerges at some point during developmental time, which becomes a better predictor of math ability at around, say, grade 5, as per the American system, so corresponding to approximately 12 years of age in Sweden. Can we observe this sort of maturation process and try to disentangle if there's something inherent to the symbolic properties of number that is especially sort of informative here? So what we did here is that we recruited a sample of children who performed a digit comparison task, so deciding which is more, which is less, and an ordinality task, so deciding, is this sequence of numbers in the correct ascending or descending order? And the idea then is that this ordinal task reflects count list semantics, so the separable associative system, which tells us important information about numerical values as in terms of how these numbers relate to one another, if they follow one another in the counting sequence, for instance. For this, we used a method called connectome-based predictive modeling, where we then took the combined sort of brain activity or functional connectivity pattern elicited by both of these tasks. So either when children were deciding which number was bigger or smaller, or either during the task where they decided if these three numbers were in the correct order or not. And this is a method by which you extract sort of the whole brain functional connectome, so all the connections that emerge during this task, and perform then a brain behavior correlation with a behavioral measure collected outside of the MRI scanner. So in this case, an arithmetic fluency task. So essentially, children were instructed to try to solve as many of these basic addition or subtraction and so on assignments as they could in 1 minute. And by applying this model, we can actually see that there are distinct differences between how the brain processes cardinal, meaning lesser, more, and ordinal aspects of symbolic number, so where ordinal refers to the number sequence. And interestingly enough, we see that there's a relationship here between symbolic cardinal number processing and non-symbolic magnitude processing. But primarily then that the ordinal task itself, sort of in isolation, is a strong predictor of participant age, even within a span of 2 years that the sample represented, showing some sort of neurodevelopmental maturation effect. But also then arithmetic fluency. So there's a strong sort of argument to be made here that the symbolic skills are the primary sort of drivers of continuing math development at this age, as opposed to sort of the more basic ability to distinguish lesser from more dots, for instance. And a lot of recent research, even ranging back to as early as last year, has begun to even more so argue for this sort of basic overarching idea that this type of estrangement of symbolic number representations, the process by which number symbols become their own thing, in lack of a better word, is actually strongly predictive of typical maturation and typical development of math skills. And this is important also because many prior sort of intervention approaches have focused a lot more on the non-symbolic aspect of numerical cognition and how we can strengthen that. Whereas we might need to also sort of include the symbolic aspect to actually try to improve and train as much as possible the knowledge of the count list, for instance, so understanding how number symbols relate to one another. So trying to sort of summarize all of this, why I think that numerical cognition is important is that it's not only related to math, as we've seen many times before during the talks today. It's really sort of a part of the toolbox of everyday problem-solving skills. We use numbers to keep track of time, scheduling our day. You all used numerical sort of cognitive mechanisms to find your way here at the correct time. For instance, by knowing which seat on a train or other type of public transport that you had reserved to get here, for instance. But also things like trading, buying goods, and comparing outcomes of different types of decisions, which are often numerically informed, at least to some extent. And of course, as a foundation for technically oriented areas of academia and other types of occupations, such as the STEM fields. Another way to look at this is what I think that our research group's sort of contribution is here, is to try to understand, if we see sort of this in terms of a hierarchy, we're trying to understand these aspects primarily. So what are the basic neurocognitive mechanisms that allow us to even perceive quantity or perceive order in both a numerical sense, but also a sort of temporal sense or more general sense? How does this feed into basic number processing? So how do we use these very basic mechanisms and apply it to concepts such as lesser or greater, behind or ahead, and establish symbolic reference? How does that in turn allow us to develop typical arithmetic and mathematical skills? So how do we use these basic mechanisms to manipulate number representations through comparison, calculation, problem solving, and so on? How does this combination of abilities and skills feed into numeracy? So applying and reasoning with numerical information, using it as some sort of basis for making a decision, either one or the other way. Especially in terms of things like financial literacy, for instance. So how do we make optimal, or at least as optimal as possible, financial decisions relating to things like where we place our pension money, for instance. And finally, sort of at the top of the pyramid here, you can say that as a catch-all term, we have judgment and decision-making. So all decisions are not sort of created equal and not super rational or informed even by something like statistics or numbers. At least a part of many of the complex decisions we make do depend to some extent on numerical information. And in order to fully understand these, I think we need to sort of build the foundations from the ground up here, understand how basic neurocognitive mechanisms contribute all the way up to these very complex sort of decisions we are faced with every day. So in other words, how do we get from this, the brain, to that, meaning judgment and decision making? As a, I think, final note before my summary, and I don't know if I've actually exceeded my time here, but that usually happens. Those of you who have seen me present before know that my lectures tend to run over. Just as a very final note, sort of, I want to make an analogy of why I think studying the brain makes sense in psychology. And I think you could tell from this analogy that I come from a cognitive science background. But the idea here is that, say that you had something like a computer, right? To understand how a computer works, it's not enough to understand the software that it runs. So you need to understand how the software works sort of within the limitations of the hardware. So how can we develop software given the components that we have to work with, essentially, right? We also need to understand the interaction between the hardware or the software for a given behavior that our computer sort of produces. So the idea is that, by analogy, I think psychology benefits from having some knowledge of the hardware, or the brain in this case, for trying to sort of find ways in which we can optimize the software or cognition in a general sense, whether it be in terms of improving one's math ability, for instance, or any other type of sort of cognitively demanding task. And we also need to sort of see how this fits into a larger sort of program or application, for lack of a better word, in terms of how is our education actually structured? How do we actually represent different types of numerical information? And are there potentially better ways to do it than we are doing right now? And also how cultural expressions form how we reason about numbers, or how we even learn number systems and number symbols. So, as a final note here, I'm not going to keep you much longer. Circling back to the sort of initial questions that I posed at the beginning here, math is hard, and I think most of us can agree that this is the case. But why is that the case? And I think I will do the sort of classic approach of answering a question with a question in order to avoid liability in this case. Math is hard partly due to the nature of the subject itself. I mean, it's inherently a difficult subject with a specific hierarchical progression of skills that needs to be in place. But I think that studying numerical cognition and including neuroscience as an aspect in this can help us sort of piece apart what are the most basic components of math, and are some of these components harder than others? Are there specific components we could target to help us get a more meaningful understanding of why math is hard? And can we take that knowledge and apply it to education to sort of help or assist in creating a more sort of easily interpreted or easily mastered version of math than we have today? And here I think that the knowledge of these lower level cognitive and neural mechanisms may be a very strong way forward. where neuroscientific study can really help us identify what are the basic mechanisms and how do they interact in complex ways to give rise to these complex cognitive abilities. So, briefly just want to mention also that what I think is most encouraging about this award to me is that it highlights and I hope also generates more interest in the field of numerical cognition, which is worldwide quite a small academic field, but particularly so in Sweden. And its importance for sort of everyday decision making and all types of tasks we're faced with. Sort of akin to the call for recruitment that Ian Lyons put out, I want to sort of twist that a bit and say that there's a lot that remains to be known in this field. So I think I speak for all of us who are researchers in this field, that we welcome in more and more people to join us. And I think also, circling back to Håkan's presentation, that there are a lot of interesting research approaches that are beginning to open up as a function of technological developments now, with machine learning as a way to sift through complex data, use of things like representational similarity analysis, which Ian Lyons talked a lot about, to pit hypotheses very cleanly against each other, for instance. And also the sort of increasingly fine-grained analyses we can make, both in terms of the data we can actually collect on shorter and shorter temporal scales and with higher and higher spatial resolution. And of course, things like single N or even small N designs. So trying to work within the limitations we have in terms of statistical power and find novel ways to conduct neuroscientific research that is actually meaningful and tells us something about these mechanisms we're trying to understand. Okay, so that concludes my talk, and I want to give a bit of acknowledgement at the end here, as I promised I would. So of course I want to thank Ulf Träff and Kenny Skagerlund for excellent supervision during my time as a PhD student. I really appreciate our ongoing collaboration still. I want to thank everyone at the Royal Society here for your assistance with putting together this symposium, which I personally think worked out really well in terms of the invited speakers. But also, of course, all my colleagues at Linköping University, and my family and friends who are present here today as well, and for all the speakers for agreeing to be here, Karin, Ian, Håkan, to make this a really interesting event. And I hope it's not just in line with my specific interests, but rather that it actually appealed to a broader audience as well, and you take something away from this and find a new or even renewed interest in numerical cognition. Yes, I'm always bad at ending talks, but yeah, please let me know if you have any additional questions. And thank you for all being here. Yeah.
All right, maybe we have time for one question from the audience. No?
I think I've talked enough for one day. So.
All right, so I would like also to direct a thank you all for attending this symposium, and I also want to thank you to our speakers, Karin and Håkan and Ian, who's not here, and also to Jonas, who helped organize this event, and the Royal Academy here. And yeah, with that, this concludes the symposium. And just a final rounding applause for everyone involved. So, thank you.